Kim Dokja was engulfed in flames, the searing heat consuming his senses. The pain was unbearable, as if he had been thrown into the depths of hell itself. He understood now, burning to death was truly one of the most excruciating ways to die. But this wasn't just suffering. This was the reality of ways of survival. He was inside the world of the novel, and yet something felt strange. There was an invisible wall surrounding this world, something he couldn't quite grasp. However, there was no time for such thoughts. He needed to act. He had gained a special attribute. King of No Killing. This power was only granted to those who had never taken a life. If it worked properly, he would return to his body soon, but just as he was about to act, a notification appeared. A conflict error had been detected. His exclusive skill clashed with King of No Killing, delaying its effects. Confusion struck him. A conflicting skill? That wasn't supposed to happen. The world around him spun, his vision distorting as a wave of dizziness took over. The next moment, his surroundings shifted, his mind transported elsewhere. He was witnessing a scene. His skill Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint had reached level 3. In the underground station at Chungmuro, Gong Pildu paced in frustration. He had no way to escape now. He cursed under his breath, thinking about the situation he was in. Everything had gone wrong because of that one person. Why did he have to listen to someone else's orders? His gaze fell on the boy resting nearby. Gilyong was asleep, his small frame curled up as if unaware of the chaos surrounding them. For a moment, an old memory surfaced in Pildu's mind. A child's voice echoed from the past. His daughter had been about the same age. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. There was no point in thinking about the past now. Just then, Senga approached, her expression lighthearted. She spoke with a gentle smile, as if trying to ease the tension between everyone. Pildu scoffed at her words, his irritation evident. He had no patience for unnecessary interactions. He wanted out of this situation and nothing else mattered. Senga smiled as she looked at Pildu. He had been smiling just moments ago, though now his expression had turned rigid. She recalled something about his past and decided to bring it up. He was once a major landowner in Chungmuro. She questioned him about the extent of his land. Pildu's response was vague. He claimed he had just as much land as anyone else. But Senga wasn't convinced. She pointed out that he was the only one with the landlord attribute, even though many others in the coalition also owned land. At this, Pildu clarified, it wasn't about how much land one owned. It was about its quality. Senga pressed further. What determined the quality of land? Pildu answered without hesitation. Land had to be expensive and highly desired. Senga's final question struck deeper. Had he truly owned land like that? Pildu hesitated for a moment before admitting that he had. Dokja, observing the scene, stood frozen in shock. None of this made sense. He wasn't physically there. He was still trapped in his own situation. Yet somehow he could see everything happening in Chungmuro. The realization hit him. This was level 3 of Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint. Before he could process further, a distant sound rumbled through the air. Senga's expression darkened. Nearby, Lee Gilyong jolted awake, instantly alert. The cockroach on his back twitched its antennae, sensing something approaching. A deep, resounding vibration echoed from the tunnel of Line 4 near Ho-hyang. Something was coming. Senga quickly stood up while Pildu activated his skill. The armed zone surrounded him, its defensive mechanism setting into place. Without hesitation, Pildu called for everyone to gather. The urgency in his voice made it clear. This wasn't just any threat. Senga immediately took charge. It was an ambush. The plan they had practiced earlier would have to be executed now. She instructed everyone to move. Group A would gather around the turrets. Group B would position themselves beyond their range. Group C had a crucial task: protect Pildu. A massive horde of ground rats surged forward, rushing toward the group. Pildu, relying on an instinct only rich landowners possessed, sensed an unsettling feeling creeping over him. It was the same instinct that told him when someone was trying to take his land. Without hesitation, he ordered everyone to huddle up. The turrets he had deployed roared to life, filling the tunnel with gunfire. Bright flashes cut through the darkness as the automated weapons locked onto their targets. One by one, the ground rats fell, their bodies piling up across the station floor. Thanks to the quick response of the group, the situation felt far easier compared to the chaos of the emergency defense. As the last of the creatures collapsed, a single thought ran through the minds of the Chungmuro members. Working together had made this battle effortless. Their coordination was paying off. But then, a voice echoed from the tunnel. Someone spoke about the flute of Hamelin as if it had failed to do its job. Another voice responded, mentioning that this was one of Junghyuk's stations, and that mere tier 9 subterraneans wouldn't have been enough to take it. Then, out of the darkness, 5 figures emerged. 4 men and 1 woman. Pildu's expression hardened. Though he couldn't pinpoint the exact reason, his gut told him these people were different from the ones they had encountered before. This was no ordinary threat. Without wasting time, he called for the samurai brat. If there was a fight coming, they needed her now. Before he could finish his sentence, she was already there, her sword in hand. She reminded him not to call her a samurai. Pildu smirked at her irritation, brushing it off with indifference. Jihei tightened her grip on her sword, making it clear that his attitude could have consequences. One of the strangers, a bald man, observed them with amusement. He remarked on the armed lord and the naval commander joining forces, as if he had confirmed something he already suspected. Pildu, now seething, demanded to know who they were and where they had come from. He threatened to gun them all down if they didn't step back. Yet the 5 individuals didn't even glance at him. Instead, they carried on their conversation, discussing numbers and alliances. They mentioned the dragon side and listed off specific numbers, weighing the strength of their opposition. Jihei's eyes burned with fury as she heard the bald man's remark. Without hesitation, she lunged forward, her sword scraping against the ground before she swung it with brutal force. The man barely managed to block the attack, his expression shifting from arrogance to shock. He hadn't expected this level of strength from her. Something was wrong. Jihei was far stronger than she should have been at this point in time. Pildu, realizing that there was no other choice, infused his turrets with magic power. The air filled with the deafening sound of gunfire as the turrets roared to life, their bullets tearing through the space. Yet, despite the fierce resistance, the opposing forces were not unprepared. They had come with more than just brute force. They possessed the Flute of Hamelin, a tool capable of commanding monsters, and they carried mana-nullifying shields, allowing them to counter Pildu's firepower. Dokja stood at a distance, his mind racing as he took in the situation. He understood their plan. These people intended to seize control of Chungmuro, not just for power, but to win over Junghyuk. With him on their side, their ambitions stretched far beyond this battlefield. They were aiming for dominance over the entire world. However, things would not go as smoothly as they had planned. Jihei and Pildu had grown much stronger than they were supposed to be in this timeline. Even Senga and Gilyong were capable of holding their ground. Chungmuro would not fall easily. As Dokja analyzed the battlefield, his gaze locked onto a cloaked figure standing amidst the chaos. A flicker of unease ran through him as he watched the man pull something out and ignite it. Within seconds, the object was hurled towards the Chungmuro group. Just before the explosion erupted, a deafening roar filled the air as a violent blast shook the platform. Fire and smoke surged across the battlefield, engulfing everything in its path. It was an overwhelming force, mana bullets of mass destruction. These weapons, while not as effective against top-tier monsters, were devastating when used against humans. Crafted from materials found in Gangseo and Gangnam, and easily acquired from the dokkaebi bag, they were among the most dangerous tools available. Dokja stood frozen in shock. The cloaked man before him wasn't just anyone, he was the king of the disciples. The purple flag on his back confirmed his identity, making it clear that the situation had turned against them. The apostles had arrived with overwhelming power, and now Chungmuro was at a disadvantage. As the dust settled, the aftermath of the attack became visible. The platform of Chungmuro was in ruins, the once solid ground now littered with fallen bodies. Coughing and groans echoed through the air as blood stained the floor. The bald man standing amidst the destruction exhaled with satisfaction. His gaze swept over the weakened group as if they were nothing more than discarded pawns. He had expected this outcome, and now he was ready to enjoy his victory. He grabbed Jihei by her hair, lifting her off the ground effortlessly. Her small body dangled in the air, her face twisted in pain as blood dripped from her lips. She struggled to breathe, her voice weak but defiant. Yet the bald man, referred to as the seventh, ignored her suffering. He expressed his amusement, treating her as if she were nothing more than a disposable character in a story. He hadn't even finished reading the events of this world, but to him, Jihei was just a fake heroine, someone without real significance. Jihei's trembling eyes found Dokja. Her lips quivered as she struggled to form words, her pain overwhelming. A desperate plea escaped her mouth. Broken, weak, but unmistakable. She was asking for help. Dokja's eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment, the world around him blurred. Had he just teleported here? How was she looking directly at him? Could she actually see him? This shouldn't have been possible. Suddenly, a message flashed before his eyes. His personal skill, the fourth wall, was resonating faintly. His heart pounded violently. Unease crept into his thoughts. Jihei was just a character. But even if she was just a character, something inside Dokja snapped. The sight before him ignited a fury he hadn't felt before. His entire being trembled with anger. That man, He was tormenting a girl as if she were nothing more than an object. Notifications flooded his vision. The effects of the fourth wall were being restricted due to increased immersion. The boundary between observer and participant was breaking. The moment he saw Jihei suffering, something deep inside him refused to stay detached. This wasn't just a story anymore. Dokja was too immersed. A deep nausea overtook him, and dizziness clouded his senses. The excessive immersion caused a sudden surge in his skill. Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint, pushing its proficiency to an unnatural level. His perception shifted, pulling him into a first-person perspective. His consciousness stretched and contracted like a rubber band, warping his sense of self. Then, his eyes opened. He was in Chungmuro. A shock ran through his body. This wasn't just a vision. He was physically there. Before he could process the impossibility of it, Jihei's trembling eyes met his. It wasn't just her. Everyone on the platform had turned their gaze toward him. His field of vision moved unnaturally, as if controlled by something beyond his own will. His body was walking forward, closing the distance between him and Jihei, but he wasn't the one controlling it. The seventh disciple's expression shifted into a frown, taking in the sight before him, but Dokja felt nothing. A deep, unsettling emotion settled inside him, something foreign, something he disliked. Jihei's lips parted slightly, trying to form words. A faint, broken sound escaped her, but before she could speak, Dokja's hand tightened around the hilt of a sword. The movement was smooth, practiced, as if he had done this countless times before. The blade sliced through the air, swift, silent, and absolute. A clean, precise cut. Then something fell to the ground. Gasps of disbelief echoed across the platform. Some stood frozen in shock, while others struggled to process the scene before them. Blood gushed violently from the seventh disciple's neck as his body collapsed. The life drained from his eyes before he even understood what had happened. His grip on Jihei loosened, and her body began to fall. Before she could hit the ground, Dokja's hands moved on their own, catching her in a firm yet gentle hold. The silence that followed was suffocating. The remaining disciples stood still, unable to comprehend the shift in power. The weight of the moment hung in the air like an unbreakable verdict. The battle for Chungmuro had been decided. Then something shifted. Dokja's consciousness began pulling away from Junghyuk's body. The overwhelming immersion faded, and the foreign presence that had taken control of him released its grip. Slowly, he returned to his own body. A flood of notifications filled his vision. The exclusive skill Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint had been deactivated. The conflicting errors within his skills were stabilizing. The privilege of the King of No Killing, which had been delayed, now resurfaced. Then, the most crucial notification of all, his body was being resurrected from death. The recreation of his flesh had begun. His vision remained hazy, the surrounding contrast and saturation shifting unnaturally. His senses struggled to realign, caught between the boundaries of life and death. His mind reeled from the trauma, unable to fully comprehend the transition, but the fourth wall was there. The exclusive skill dampened the mental shock, shielding him from the unbearable weight of what had just happened. It was the only reason his mind remained intact. Dokja gasped inwardly as his senses returned. A burning sensation filled his lungs, the heat spreading through his body. His revival had been successful, and he was back. His thoughts raced as he processed everything. Junghyuk was handling Chungmuro, which meant there was no immediate danger there, but something still lingered. Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint, level 3. The dizziness in his head refused to fade, the memories of moments ago still fresh. He had been in Junghyuk's perspective. Every detail remained vivid in his mind. The light yet efficient footsteps, the firm grip of long fingers on the hilt of the blade, and the chilling precision of that flawless strike. It had been so natural, so effortless, but it was something he never wanted to experience again. The overwhelming immersion, the loss of control, it was terrifying. How had he become Junghyuk? A notification flickered before him, signaling that the reward for Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint level 3 was being prepared. Another notification followed, revealing the activation of his newly acquired attribute, the King of No Killing. Despite its misleading name, this attribute granted him something invaluable: immortality. The ability allowed him to resurrect, but it wasn't unlimited. Resurrection required the consumption of karma points. He had been given 100 points to start with, along with an additional bonus resurrection. His gaze shifted across the battlefield. His allies were already recovering from the chaos. Heewon's voice rang out from the distance, shock clear on her face. Hyunsung was beside her, keeping her steady. Minsub and Sunguk stood frozen, staring in disbelief, their eyes fixated on him as if witnessing something impossible. Dokja turned his attention to the footholds. A number 2 was marked on one of them. The others had already moved ahead, standing in their designated spots. There was no time to waste. Heewon quickly assessed the situation situation and made a decision. Hyunsung responded without hesitation, rushing toward Dokja. The soldier's breath was heavy as he arrived, sweat dripping from his face. His concern was evident as his gaze locked onto Dokja, trying to process what had just happened. Then, the atmosphere changed. A powerful force surged through the air. The absolute shield activated, forming an impenetrable defense. At the same moment, Ignir, the lesser dragon, unleashed its flames of destruction. Fire erupted, engulfing the space in a violent inferno. The heat distorted the surroundings, consuming everything in its path. Through the chaos, Hyunsung finally found his voice. He had seen it with his own eyes, but it still didn't make sense. Dokja had returned from the dead. The disbelief lingered in his expression as he tried to confirm what he had witnessed. However, something else caught his attention. His gaze shifted downward, realization dawning upon him. The resurrection had worked, but at a cost. The external suit had melted away. Most of the items Dokja had collected were destroyed in the process. He was left with nothing, completely exposed naked. He quickly scanned his surroundings. Among the debris, he spotted his sword and a flag lying at the dragon's feet. As soon as the shield vanished, movement erupted from a distance. Hyewon was the first to sprint forward, her pace quick and determined. As she approached Dokja, her expression hardened, eyes scanning the aftermath of destruction. A notification surfaced. Abyssal Black Flame Dragon had taken notice of Dokja's black dragon. Dokja, flustered, knew there was nothing to be done. The flames consumed everything in their path, sparing only scenario items and artifacts. Hyewon reached him and, without hesitation, handed over Samyeongdong's straw robe. She reassured him that she had not looked, urging him to focus on the more pressing matters ahead. A wave of relief passed through Dokja as he accepted the robe, deciding to wear it for now. Ignir, the dragon, let out a powerful roar, its body coiling as it prepared to unleash another surge of fire capable of reducing everything to ashes. Dokja took charge, signaling for the group to move without delay. Sungguk, his face pale, looked towards Dokja with uncertainty. The disciples, who had once been gathered in numbers, were now nothing more than charred remains. The blue ice pills, untouched by the flames, lay scattered amongst them. These pills had a long digestion time and did not melt under heat, making them one of the few things left intact. Suddenly, the air trembled as a massive dragon's paw swung through the battlefield. A deafening cry rang out as two prophets, trailing behind the group, were crushed beneath its weight, their bodies reduced to lifeless remains. Dokja moved swiftly, reaching the center of the platform. His hands closed around Unbroken Faith and the brown flag, securing them as he assessed the situation. The battlefield had cleared. The only ones left standing were his own party members. As he calculated their next move, the time for the footholds to activate had already arrived. One foothold lit up with the number 5. Unlike before, only a single foothold was activated. The situation had become even more precarious. The mid-level dokkaebi's voice echoed through the air, carrying an amused tone as it observed the battle. It taunted the survivors, questioning how long their luck would hold. Hyewon exhaled sharply, frustration evident in her expression. She turned to Dokja, seeking direction. There was no time to hesitate. The only option left was to fight. The absolute shield dissipated, removing the protective barrier that had kept them safe. Dokja quickly assessed the situation. The blue ice pills brought by the disciples were still intact, scattered on the ground. There were exactly 5 of them, just enough for the 5 remaining members of the party. If everyone took a pill, they might stand a chance against the lesser dragon. The real concern was whether they could eliminate it before it unleashed another devastating area of effect attack. Dokja shouted for the group to move, urging them to grab the blue pills from the ground. Victory might be within reach if they could use them. His mind raced, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the party. Hyunsung possessed immense strength, capable of using Mountain Crush, but his speed was lacking. Meanwhile, Hyewon was quick and agile, but did not have enough raw power to deal significant damage. There was only one way to increase their chances of survival. Dokja made a decision, pouring 4,100 coins into his magic power. The stat surged from level 16 to level 25. Instead of increasing his strength, he chose to amplify his magic power, knowing it was the fastest way to bring down the lesser dragon. Without hesitation, he grabbed one of the blue ice pills and swallowed it. A sudden shift resonated through his body. His soul attuned more deeply to the world. A flood of thoughts raced through his mind. What was the best course of action? Should the entire group attack simultaneously? Was there a way to pinpoint the dragon's weakness? His memory stirred. There had been some sort of reward before. If he could recall it, he might gain an advantage. A flurry of notifications flashed across his vision. The exclusive skill Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint was already in use. A new compensation for reaching stage 3 of the skill had become available. Without wasting a moment, Dokja activated the reward. A strange sensation overtook him. For an instant, he was no longer just himself. He was seeing through the perspective of a protagonist. A realization struck him. He could take one skill from a character he had been immersed in. The implications were staggering. Did this mean he could acquire one of Heewon's skills? No, this was something far greater. Or could he actually obtain a skill from Junghyuk? The thought left him momentarily dazed, his mind clouded with confusion. Just then, the lesser dragon's massive paw came crashing down from above. Dokja had no time to react. At the last second, a force collided with him. Heewon's body slammed against his, shoving him out of harm's way. The ground where he had stood moments ago exploded under the weight of the dragon's attack. Dust and debris filled the air as the battle continued. Heewon's voice rang out, sharp with frustration. Her expression was tense as she glared at Dokja, demanding to know what he was doing. There was no time for carelessness. He had nearly died just moments ago, but Dokja barely registered her words. His mind was lost in the flood of notifications filling his vision. A list of skills from Junghyuk had appeared before him. Cold resistance, fire resistance, and lie detection. Each one had its own advantages, but none were as powerful as he had hoped. Dokja smirked inwardly. There had never been a chance of receiving abilities like Tiger God Aura or Skybreaker. Those were far beyond reach. Among the 3 available skills, lie detection would be the most useful in the long run, but at this moment, survival came first. Fire resistance was the obvious choice, yet something tugged at his instincts. He was a reader. The answer was always in what he had read. Images flashed through his mind. The lesser dragon's attack patterns from the 12th, 14th, and 17th regressions. Information that had once been distant knowledge now became a lifeline. Heewon called out to him, urgency in her tone. Dokja exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Then, with a firm decision, he selected cold resistance. A notification flickered before him, confirming the activation of the skill. There was no time to hesitate. He turned to Heewon and Hyunsung, asking if they had taken the blue ice pills. His demand was abrupt, catching them off guard. He insisted that they hand over the pills immediately. Heewon's eyes widened in confusion. The hesitation was mirrored in Sungguk and Minsub. Minsub, just about to put the pill into his mouth, froze in place. Sungguk's voice carried a note of disbelief. Dokja was taking everything from them. Without waiting for further objections, Dokja grabbed the 4 remaining ice pills. Then, without hesitation, he poured all 4 pills into his mouth and swallowed them at once. A surge of notifications flooded his vision. The system acknowledged his actions. The attribute overlay effect of the ice pill intensified his elemental damage. 200% ice damage was now added. A chilling sensation spread through his entire body, an unnatural cold seeping into his bones. Under normal circumstances, he would have never attempted this. The ice pill was, in reality, a type of poison. Consuming even one would make a person feel as though they were standing naked in the middle of a relentless winter storm. Dokja's voice cut through the chaos, ordering everyone to move behind him. His blade was drawn in an instant, and the energy around it shifted. Blade of Unbreakable Faith activated, its ether property turning into darkness. The lingering effect of the ice pills infused the weapon further, coating the darkness with frost. Without hesitation, he triggered Sword Song, and a forgotten phrase from the naval warfare god took form. The words came like an omen, cryptic yet absolute, that multiple paths can lead to victory, but there is also a hidden condition that, if not met, will result in failure. The colors of the lesser dragon shifted before his eyes. Most of its massive body gleamed green, but there were patches of a deeper, more dangerous red. The realization struck immediately. These were its weak points. The meaning behind the Duke of Loyalty and Warfare became clear in an instant. His body surged forward, cutting through the fire as his sword aimed for the first target. The blade connected with the pale red mark on the dragon's head, and a piercing cry tore from the creature. Its body recoiled from the strike. His blade sliced through the Achilles tendon of the beast's hind leg. Another agonized scream erupted as the second weak point, a deeper red than the first, was torn apart beneath his attack. The dragon flailed violently, its tail whipping through the air in a desperate attempt to crush him. The dragon's movements grew erratic, but its next action was unmistakable. A shift in its posture, the gathering of energy within its body. Flames of destruction was moments away from being unleashed. The battle had to end before that happened. There was no second chance. The footholds had already proven unpredictable. The previous round had only spawned a single platform, marked with the number 5. That had been luck. If the next foothold carried a 3, 4, or even 6, survival would become impossible. The risk was too great. The sword in his hand felt heavier, his grip tightening as his focus sharpened. Junghyuk's techniques surfaced in his mind. His movements had always been invisible, silent, efficient. If that sword swing could be replicated even once, a sharp sensation surged through his body, something close to instinct overtook overtaking him. The sword moved, guided by something beyond conscious thought. The motion felt perfect, a seamless flow of power and precision. The strike landed, and an explosion of ice energy erupted across the dragon's chest. The force of the impact sent a shockwave tearing through the battlefield. The lesser dragon still refused to fall. Even as its body suffered wounds beyond recovery, it let out an agonized roar, flames bursting wildly across the battlefield. The scorching heat distorted the air, forcing Hyunsung, Hiwon, and the others to brace themselves against the impending destruction. Dokja landed on his feet, his breathing heavy, eyes scanning the surroundings. For a brief moment, he believed it was over, but then movement flickered in the corner of his vision. Ignir's massive tail lashed out with terrifying force. The impact came before he could react. The thick, muscular tail slammed into Dokja's body, sending him flying through the air like a broken doll. Blood surged up his throat, spilling from his lips. His limbs trembled, barely able to move. Pain blurred his vision, but a thought surfaced amidst the haze. Was this really the end? His body refused to listen, his consciousness fading. He wasn't the protagonist. If this had been Junghyuk, the battle would have ended with a single decisive strike. But he wasn't the main character, he was just a reader. A surge of frustration ignited in his chest. His fingers curled tightly around the hilt of his sword. His arm moved on instinct, drawing the last remnants of his strength. The sword tore through the air. A desperate, final attack aimed at the dragon's heart. Something burst within Ignir's massive body. The blade of faith struck true, piercing deep into the dragon's core. Cold energy spread violently from the wound, freezing over its entire form. The dragon's movement slowed, then stopped completely. The monstrous being, once burning with destructive flames, was now encased in ice, unable to fight any longer. Dokja's entire body shuddered from exhaustion. His lungs struggled for air, his vision swaying. He refused to fall. He had survived. The notifications flickering before his eyes confirmed it. He had claimed first blood on the minor catastrophe, the lesser dragon Ignir. He was the first to contribute to the clearing of the fifth main scenario. An impossible feat had been accomplished. A thought surfaced in his mind, an old memory from Junghyuk's sixth regression. The familiarity of this moment, the sensation of coming so close to death. Was he recalling it now because he was dangerously close to the same fate? Forcing his body forward, Dokja staggered toward the frozen corpse. His trembling hands reached into the dragon's body, pulling free the searing core. It was the Tier 5 fire dragon nucleus. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his strength nearly spent. Then, without warning, a sharp slap landed on his back. The sudden force knocked him forward, his already weakened body hitting the ground instantly. Hiwon stood behind him, her presence looming over his crumpled form. The impact had sent him flat on the cold surface, his limbs refusing to cooperate. Dokja remained still, exhausted from the battle, but her words lingered in the air. His resurrection had made it seem like death was nothing more than a minor setback, but he knew better. A quiet whisper escaped Hiwon as she looked at him closely. There was something accusatory in her tone, as if she already knew the answer but needed to hear it confirmed. She asked if he had known what was going to happen again. Dokja did not meet her gaze directly. He admitted that he hadn't known everything, not all of it. Her frustration boiled over, and once again her palm landed hard against his back. His already weakened body barely held itself up from the force. Before he could regain his balance, Hyunsung came running over, his face filled with concern. His voice carried urgency as he asked if Dokja was all right. Dokja exhaled sharply, his body still aching from the battle. He explained that he had managed to revive thanks to a new skill. There was no divine miracle, no special grace from some benevolent god. His supporting constellation wasn't some holy figure that granted endless resurrections. Hiwon narrowed her eyes at him, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. If his skill allowed him to resurrect, then did that mean he could keep coming back as long as he saved people? That seemed too powerful. Dokja clarified. The ability wasn't unlimited. For every 100 lives he saved, he could return once. It was strong, but far from invincible. A quiet determination settled over Hiwon. If that was the case, then they would need to work hard to save lives from now on. Dokja acknowledged her words, though he knew the reality of their situation. It wouldn't be easy. Hiwon, however, didn't falter. Without hesitation, she assured him that she would take care of it. If saving people was what they needed to do, then she would do it. Her confidence brought a rare moment of reassurance, but beneath the surface, Dokja knew the critical flaw of his ability. King of No Killing had a condition, one that could not be broken. He could not kill anything of the same species as himself. The moment he did, he would lose his position. Up until now, he had never killed a single person. Hyunsung, still processing everything, spoke with a strange sense of wonder. The abilities they were gaining, the way the world was shifting. It was like something straight out of a fantasy novel. Dokja allowed himself a faint smirk. In a way, that was exactly what this was. Minsub and Sunguk stood nearby, watching the conversation unfold. They nodded at Dokja's words, their postures slightly stiff. He noticed the way Sunguk glared at them, silently warning them to keep their mouths shut. Dokja hadn't expected them to survive either. Then, unexpectedly, Sunguk spoke. His voice carried uncertainty, hesitation. He questioned Dokja's sudden change in behavior. Why was he suddenly being so nice to them? Dokja didn't bother explaining. The act was over. There was no need to pretend to be Jung-hyuk anymore. Whatever reasons he had for acting the way he didn't need to be stated. Instead, he extended his hand toward them, demanding their phones without hesitation. Sunguk hesitated, frustration evident in his expression. His voice carried disbelief as he questioned whether this was happening again. Without waiting for an answer, Dokja took their phones, securing them in his grasp. There was no resistance. Sunguk's shoulders trembled as his emotions overflowed. He had thought Dokja was done pretending to be Jung-hyuk, but clearly that wasn't the case. Dokja remained unmoved. His answer was simple. This was just how he was. Internally, however, his thoughts were racing. Most of the items he had gathered throughout this scenario were gone. The losses were significant, but none compared to the biggest one of all, his phone. The one thing he couldn't afford to lose. If the file disappeared, if the email he had received from the author was deleted, he hurriedly checked one of the stolen devices, his fingers moving quickly, navigating through the unfamiliar interface. Then the download bar appeared, and finally the process was complete. A wave of relief washed over Dokja. So this was how it worked. A document that not even the dokkaebi or the constellations had access to couldn't be deleted so easily. The realization reassured him, but another thought followed. If the renouncers had ways to read this document, then he needed to be careful. There was always a possibility of someone watching. Dokja wasted no time. He opened Ways of Survival and began to read. His eyes moved swiftly across the text, the effects of his exclusive attribute enhancing his reading speed. The details unfolded before him, revealing a crucial moment, an event that had taken place during Jung-hyuk's 6th regression. Meanwhile, in the Soul Branch, a dokkaebi named Barum sat at his station, his expression darkened by irritation. A scenario document rested in his hands, and at the top, a name stood out, Regressor Jung-hyuk. Barum's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. The word regressor weighed heavily on his mind. Lately, both dokkaebi and constellations had been quick to recognize these anomalies. There was no mystery to it anymore. People were catching on too easily. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Another dokkaebi had approached him, bringing news of a formal complaint. The source of the complaint was a Japanese dokkaebi named Aoni. Baram's expression soured. Aoni should have been focusing on his own region, yet he was meddling in affairs that weren't his concern. The increasing competition among low-ranking dokkaebi had only fueled such interference. As Baram reviewed the data, he couldn't completely dismiss the validity of the complaint. The accusations raised questions about the plausibility of Jung-hyuk's character. The inconsistencies were undeniable. He had possessed high-level skills from the beginning, abilities that should have taken much longer to acquire. Classified information, usually censored automatically, had been accessible to him. Even the Eye of the Sage skill had presented challenges, forcing them to seek clearance from higher-ups just to verify certain details. Despite this, Baram dismissed the concerns. The higher-ups had already given their approval. There was no need to take action. The advantages Jung-hyuk held would eventually balance out as the scenarios progressed. For now, their focus needed to remain elsewhere. The 5th scenario was about to begin. That was where their attention should be. Whatever backlash came, it was likely that Jung-hyuk had a constellation capable of handling it. Back in the present, Dokja remained absorbed in his reading. The words on the screen filled his mind with calculations and possibilities. Just then, the sudden flicker of dokkaebi communication disrupted his concentration. Baehyung appeared abruptly, his expression filled with frustration. His presence alone was enough to confirm that things had not gone smoothly. The situation had escalated beyond his control, and he had been repeatedly summoned by the management because of Dokja. Dokja observed the dokkaebi's irritated demeanor and wasted no time in addressing the issue. He needed to know how things had gone. Baehyung's frustration spilled over as he relayed the aftermath. The management had completely lost their composure. His skill had caused a major disturbance, and the higher-ups were in an uproar. The real issue wasn't just the skill itself, it was the fact that no one, not even the higher-ranking dokkaebi, could access information about it. That level of secrecy was an anomaly in itself. Dokja remained composed as he pressed for more details. If the management was so agitated, had they decided to penalize him? Baehyung sighed in exasperation but reassured him. Thanks to his defense, the management had ultimately decided to let Dokja be. The reasoning was simple. He didn't possess an overwhelming number of skills, nor was he particularly proficient in the ones he had. From their perspective, he wasn't powerful enough to create an unfair advantage in the scenarios. Dokja had anticipated this outcome. Internally, he acknowledged that his precautions had paid off. He had deliberately avoided leveling up his passive skills, knowing that something like this might happen. By keeping his abilities at a lower level, he had ensured that his power remained just below the threshold of suspicion. Baehyung continued, explaining that there had been resistance from others who believed otherwise. Some had argued that Dokja's advantages were still too significant. However, the final orders had come from much higher up. Even more surprising was the revelation that the command had been issued directly by the Dokkaebi king. If Dokja wanted more details, he would have to ask the mid-level Dokkaebi in charge of the area. Despite being here now, Baehyung wasn't actually supposed to be present. Too many eyes were watching. The situation was precarious, and Dokja needed to be careful. The mid-level Dokkaebi overseeing this region was looking for an excuse to take action against him. These plausibility reviews were no different from tax investigations. They were relentless, invasive, and difficult to escape. For a while, things would not be easy. As if on cue, the mid-level Dokkaebi reappeared. His demeanor was formal, but the tension beneath his words was evident. There had been complications, resulting in a delay in issuing Dokja's rewards. It was an inconvenience, but the rewards would now be delivered. A flood of notifications filled Dokja's vision. The system acknowledged his achievements, and the long-awaited rewards were finally granted. For completing the hidden scenario, he received 3,000 coins. For landing the first kill on a tier 5 fire dragon, he obtained an additional 15,000 coins. But that wasn't all. Another reward stood out, a protection symbol of the Immuntar. This was granted for being the first to defeat a minor catastrophe. The significance of this item went beyond immediate benefits. It ensured that he would earn the favor of the Immuntar in the future. The journey from Anguk Station to Cheongmuro was longer than Dokja had expected. Along the way, the group exchanged information, trying to make sense of everything that had happened so far. Dokja turned his attention to Minsub and Sungguk, curious about how they had managed to group together so quickly. Minsub explained that shortly after the first scenario had ended, a mysterious figure had appeared at his station. This person had introduced himself as a disciple, claiming to have read the entire revelation. He had been searching for others, prophets, who would follow in his footsteps. What made the situation even more unusual was that this wasn't an isolated incident. The same thing had happened simultaneously in different places. It was difficult to believe that a single person could have orchestrated such a widespread movement. Because of this, people had started referring to him as the first disciple. As the group continued moving, Dokja was reminded of an immediate problem: his current state. The resurrection had left him with nothing, and he was still completely exposed. He turned to Sungguk, demanding something to wear. Sungguk hesitated for a moment before realizing what was being asked of him. As they approached their destination, Dokja spotted Senga in the distance. Her eyes were wet with emotion, revealing the weight of everything she had endured. The hardships she had faced were evident in her expression, but even so, she stood firm. Meanwhile, Hyunsung and Heewon, who had no idea what had happened in Cheongmuro, rushed toward the approaching group. Their faces were filled with shock as they took in the sight before them. The events that had unfolded were beyond anything they had expected. The railroad tracks were stained with blood, evidence of a fierce battle that had taken place. The remnants of a brutal fight stretched along the rails, and Minsub's voice trembled as he processed the scene. The severed heads of disciples numbered 2, 3, 4, and 7 were lined up neatly, their faces frozen in expressions of shock. Their deaths had come so swiftly that they had not even realized it. Dokja did not need to guess who was responsible for this. Only one person was capable of such precise and ruthless efficiency. He turned to Gil-young and asked about Junghyuk's whereabouts. Before an answer could be given, a powerful presence loomed from the direction of the Hohyeon tunnel. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking it. Junghyuk had completed his hunt. The arrogance and dignity in his movements were unmistakable. Then, a severed head came flying through the air. It landed on the tracks and rolled like a discarded toy. Draped in a cloak marked with the number 1, it was instantly recognizable. The first disciple. Dokja understood immediately. Junghyuk had chased this man to the ends of the battlefield and had finally slain him. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by unease. There were still unanswered questions, uncertainties that gnawed at his thoughts. If the first disciple had been dealt with so easily, then something felt wrong. And then, the impossible happened. The severed head suddenly spoke. The first disciple, despite being decapitated, remained conscious. His eyes sparkled, and he smiled as he called out the one responsible for ruining his plans. Minsub was paralyzed with shock, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. Dokja, equally stunned, processed the absurdity of the situation. The first disciple's head had been completely severed from his body, yet he showed no signs of death. There was no bleeding, no signs of decay, just an unnatural persistence that defied logic. The realization struck like lightning. Dokja recalled his earlier conversation with young Minsa, piecing together the clues that had been overlooked. This wasn't just any disciple, this was the true leader, the king of the disciples. His mind raced. In Ways of Survival, the number of skills that allowed someone to remain alive after decapitation was extremely limited. This was something rare, something beyond the norm. Yet the first disciple was not only surviving, he wasn't even bleeding. That meant only one thing. There was only one skill that could explain this phenomenon: the avatar skill. Dokja's thoughts sharpened, analyzing every piece of information. The first disciple had moved freely across Seoul as soon as the scenario started, gathering the renouncers, breaking through barriers, and displaying powers that should not have been possible. Now even death did not claim him. He drew closer to the severed head, his mind already reaching the most plausible conclusion. There were only a few individuals in Ways of Survival who could use the avatar skill. It was a power linked to professions that required immense creativity, or to people who suffered from extreme mental strain enough to cause dissociative identity disorder. Dokja's thoughts solidified as he processed the information before him. There was no doubt about it. The being in front of him was not physically present. This was merely an avatar, a projection of someone controlling events from elsewhere. The conclusion was clear. The first disciple was an author. That single revelation unraveled a web of mysteries, explaining the impossible feats he had performed since the scenario began. However, before Dokja could dwell further on the implications, the severed head let out a laugh. The voice carried amusement, but there was something unsettling beneath it. The first disciple confirmed it. He was the one who had written the revelation. Dokja's thoughts sharpened. This wasn't what he meant. He had suspected the man to be an author, but this claim was something else entirely. Writing the revelation? What did that even mean? His mind worked quickly as he activated the exclusive skill Fourth Wall. At the same time, Jung-hyuk, standing close by, activated his own ability, Lee Detection. The first disciple continued, stating that he was not only the author, but also the sole possessor of the revelation. Then, the system intervened. A notification rang out. Jung-hyuk had verified that the statement was true. A jolt of alarm ran through Dokja. He couldn't believe it. If this man really possessed the file, did that mean he was the true author of Ways of Survival? The possibility was absurd. It didn't add up. Calming his mind, he pushed for more information. He needed to know exactly what this so-called revelation was. He couldn't afford to act rashly. The first disciple responded with a cryptic answer. It was an epic tale, a prophecy foretelling events yet to come. Another notification appeared. This time, the system confirmed that the statement was only partially true. That response carried deeper implications. Dokja processed the new clue. If it wasn't a complete truth, then what was being twisted? Before he could push further, the first disciple shifted the conversation. The question was turned back on him. How had Dokja discovered his plan? Was he also a prophet? The word sparked something in Dokja's mind. The contradiction was clear. The first disciple had just claimed to be the one who wrote the revelation, and yet he did not know the answer to this question. The first disciple laughed again, dismissing the notion of omnipotence. But Dokja had already made up his mind. This man was lying. He was no author of Ways of Survival. If he truly was, then he would have recognized Dokja immediately. After all, Dokja was the only reader who had ever finished the story. The first disciple spoke with an air of intrigue, his voice carrying the weight of unexpected knowledge. He mentioned a woman in Seodamun Penitentiary, someone he had anticipated would be the last of his kind. Yet, instead of her, he had encountered Dokja, a presence he had not foreseen. Dokja's mind sharpened at the mention of the penitentiary. The name was familiar, but the relevance of this moment eluded him. Before he could reflect further, the first disciple shifted the conversation, making an offer. He proposed a trade. If Dokja revealed his identity, he would provide valuable information in return. But Dokja had no interest in bargains with someone like him. He recognized manipulation when he saw it. The weight of his own knowledge was far greater than anything this man could offer. His response remained firm. There was nothing he needed to learn from the first disciple. Laughter followed, sharp and condescending. The first disciple accused Dokja of arrogance, believing he had grown overconfident after outsmarting him this time. Yet beneath the amusement, there was a shift, a veiled warning that this encounter was not what it seemed. He reminded Dokja that this was not his true body, merely a projection. If circumstances had been different, the outcome would not have favored him. Dokja did not allow him to finish. His interruption was deliberate, precise. This moment was an opportunity, not just to challenge the first disciple, but to provoke Jung-hyuk, who had been listening all along. The reaction came instantly. Jung-hyuk, overhearing the words, was momentarily stunned. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his expression. The system responded as well, confirming the truth of Dokja's statement. The first disciple's confidence faltered, his expression stiffened, the certainty in his voice wavering for the first time. Denial came quickly. He refused to accept that Dokja could know more than he did. But then, realization struck, a hesitation, a pause long enough to betray his thoughts. Dokja watched carefully. If his suspicion was correct, then the answer was clear. There were no existing records of ways of survival outside of his own. The novel had never been popular enough to be widely distributed, and yet this man possessed knowledge only someone with access to the full text could have. Everything clicked into place. The files, the understanding of the scenarios, the uncanny familiarity with events. It all pointed to a single conclusion, the weight of certainty behind it. Dokja knew exactly who this man was. The first disciple's composure cracked. His reaction was immediate. The careful facade he had maintained began to unravel. Dokja recognized the truth in that moment. There was no doubt left. The man before him was exactly who he had suspected all along. Dokja spoke with a cold finality, his gaze fixed on the severed head before him. The weight of his words carried a deep resentment. Why did this man continue to do this? The memory of what the real creator had suffered because of him still lingered in Dokja's mind, unsettling and relentless. The pain of another had been twisted into personal gain, and even now, in a ruined world, this man had not changed. The rest of the party watched in confusion. From their perspective, Dokja was speaking to a decapitated head, yet his words held a venom that suggested a deeper history. The first disciple, momentarily thrown off by the accusation, demanded an explanation. Dokja remained unfazed. The knowledge this man possessed had always felt incomplete, as if he had only grasped fragments of something much greater. His actions reeked of desperation, of someone who had spent his life feeding off the work of others. Even now, with everything in chaos, he continued down the same path, clinging to a stolen legacy. The first disciple's severed head turned toward Jung-hyuk, shifting his focus. He pleaded for an alliance, declaring that he alone possessed the full revelation. Only he could guide Jung-hyuk to the end of the road he walked. Without his help, the 46th scenario would be impossible to clear. He spoke of enemies, Anna Croft, Zarathustra, formidable foes that Jung-hyuk could never defeat alone. Jung-hyuk, unimpressed, dismissed his claims outright. The so-called revelation was meaningless to him. He had never even heard of it. The first disciple pressed on, trying to justify himself. It was not just a prophecy, but a guiding truth, something Jung-hyuk could verify through his abilities. He was the last one who held its secrets, the last chance at victory. Jung-hyuk's eyes darkened as he activated Eye of the Sage, searching for the truth in the man's words. At the same time, Dokja attempted to use Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint, but his body protested. Fatigue locked his skill away, leaving him blind to the insights he desperately needed. A sharp frustration ran through Dokja. This was the worst possible moment for his skill to fail him. The first disciple seized the opportunity, his voice rising with urgency. Jung-hyuk needed to act now. The man standing before them was dangerous. He had not only impersonated Jung-hyuk, but had also disrupted the natural course of the future. Leaving him alive would only cause further damage. Dokja did not flinch. The hypocrisy was blatant. The first disciple was no different. He had done just as much, perhaps even worse. Yet the desperate plea continued. The first disciple insisted on his own uniqueness, claiming he was different. He offered everything in exchange for an alliance, even a contract if necessary. Betrayal, he swore, would never come from him. Jung-hyuk took a step forward, his expression unreadable. Two men stood before him, one who called himself a prophet and another who declared himself a revelator. The first disciple, sensing the shifting atmosphere, grew frantic. His desperation surged as he commanded that Dokja must die immediately. But before anything else could happen, Jung-hyuk stepped over the severed head, silencing the frantic voice for a moment. Dokja's breath caught for a moment. His mind raced to process what just happened. Jung-hyuk's actions were unpredictable, and before he could even react, a blade was already moving toward his neck. The cold steel of Jung-hyuk's sword pressed against his skin, and in that moment, the tension in the air thickened. Jung-hyuk turned his attention to the first disciple, who remained trapped in his severed state. With a firm and unwavering voice, Jung-hyuk posed a question. If the first disciple truly knew the future, then he should already know the answer. Would he kill Dokja here and now? Heewon, witnessing the scene, rushed toward them in alarm. Her voice broke through the heavy silence, questioning what Jung-hyuk Jung-hyuk was doing. But before she could interfere, Dokja raised his hand, signaling for her and the rest of the party to stay back. His gaze remained locked on Jung-hyuk, trying to decipher his intentions. The first disciple, still desperate, shouted his response with certainty. Jung-hyuk would kill Dokja. That was the inevitable course of events, the fate already decided. It had to happen. The blade moved, but the expected sound of flesh being cut never came. Instead, the sharp crunch of bone and flesh bursting apart echoed through the space. Jung-hyuk's foot had come down once more, crushing what remained of the first disciple's head. Even though it was only an avatar, the pain from such destruction would undoubtedly cause severe psychological damage to the man controlling it. Jung-hyuk barely spared the broken remains another glance. His expression remained unreadable as he simply stated the truth. The first disciple had been nothing but empty words after all. Dokja stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Jung-hyuk had chosen to spare him. The man who had been set on eliminating him not too long ago had deliberately gone against the so-called revelation. Their eyes met for a brief second. Then, without another word, Jung-hyuk turned away and started walking. Dokja snapped out of his daze as he watched the man leave. His voice broke through the silence, demanding an answer. Where was Jung-hyuk going? Was he really planning to leave Ji-hae behind? Without hesitation, Jung-hyuk responded. The future had changed, and so had his plans. He had no reason to stay. Dokja, unwilling to let the conversation end there, pushed further. If things had changed, then why not work together? He could help. Jung-hyuk had already made his decision. The debt had been repaid, and that was all. He was ready to leave, but Dokja was not willing to let him go so easily. Dokja reminded Jung-hyuk of the system's restrictions. Leaving the group without permission would result in punishment. The words were meant as a warning, but they only provoked a reaction as Jung-hyuk's hand moved to unsheath his blade. Sensing the rising tension, Dokja quickly adjusted his approach, letting out a nervous chuckle. He already knew Jung-hyuk's plan. The next destination would be Jung-gu, where he would compete in the scenario. His ultimate goal was obtaining the black flag by completing the king's path. Dokja offered to help, but Jung-hyuk remained unmoved. If speed was the concern, then taking Dokja's flag right now would be the fastest option. Dokja met the challenge head-on, fully aware of the gamble he was taking. He was not afraid. If it came down to it, would Jung-hyuk's sword be faster, or would Dokja's words prevail? Rather than continuing south, Dokja proposed an alternative. Instead of heading to Jung-gu, they should go north. He could help Jung-hyuk take the Tyrant King's territory and claim his flag instead. It was a different approach, but one that could work. Jung-hyuk dismissed the suggestion. He could handle it alone, but Dokja was not finished. Time was running out. There were only 48 hours left until the scenario ended. Conquering over 20 stations and securing a black flag in that time would be nearly impossible, even for someone like Jung-hyuk. And more than that, there was another reason he should head north, one he could not ignore. Dokja's words struck deep. Would Jung-hyuk abandon his family again? The shift in atmosphere was instant. Anger flickered in Jung-hyuk's eyes, his expression darkening. The fury was unmistakable, but Dokja remained steady. There was no need for hostility. This was not a fight. He was trying to help. Jung-hyuk's voice remained cold. This was a world where survival came first. Every man for himself. He demanded to know what Dokja wanted in return. Dokja's request was simple. He wanted to know one thing. The man whose head had just been crushed, what was his attribute? One of them had to be the last renouncer. But what about the other one? What exactly had that man been? For a moment, silence lingered. Then, after a pause, Jung-hyuk finally spoke. 10 minutes later, Dokja called Minsub and Sunguk aside. The matter he needed to discuss was separate from the others, something that required their specific knowledge. Dokja began by mentioning a novel, one they might have heard of, 6S Grade Infinite Regressor. Sunguk reacted immediately. He had read it before. At one point, the novel had even reached the #1 ranking. Minsub also recalled it. Now that he thought about it, the novel had been a strange combination of different stories, a mishmash of familiar elements. Despite this, Sunguk admitted that it had been an entertaining read. Dokja considered their responses. If they had read Ways of Survival, then they likely had a good grasp of web novels in general. He himself had come across 6S Grade Infinite Regressor, while Ways of Survival was still being serialized. It had been on the list of popular works at the time. Then Dokja revealed the truth. The first disciple, the man they had just encountered, was the author of 6S Grade Infinite Regressor. The revelation caught both Minsub and Sunguk off guard. Dokja had always known that the novel had relied heavily on cliches, but what stood out were the finer details and how they had been arranged. Back then, he had left a comment pointing it out, only to have his inbox flooded with hate messages from enraged readers. The author of Ways of Survival, on the other hand, had been amused, happy that his novel was gaining more views because of the controversy. Sunguk processed the the information, his thoughts catching up to the implication. The novel had been plagiarized. Dokja confirmed it. The first disciple had copied Ways of Survival, and in doing so, he had gained knowledge of future events. Minsub began to grow uneasy. If that was the case, then didn't it mean their chances of defeating him were slim? If the plagiarism extended to the end of the story, then he would know everything that would happen. But Dokja had already considered this. The first disciple had not copied the entire novel. He had only plagiarized the beginning, ensuring that if he was ever accused, he could deny it later. As a result, his knowledge was incomplete. As time passed, his understanding of the events would begin to run out. That was their advantage. Minsub hesitated before asking how Dokja could be so sure. His certainty was unsettling, as if he knew something no one else did. Dokja did not answer directly. The truth was simple. He had been the only reader after episode 100, but that was not something he needed to explain. Instead, he shifted the conversation to what mattered. There was something he needed them to do. Earlier, they had mentioned that the Revelators had been defeated by the Tyrant King. Minsub confirmed it. Their group had tried to take over Changsun Station, but they had failed. Sungguk added that some of the Revelators were still alive, now serving as prisoners. They were likely being forced to provide information. That was exactly what Dokja wanted to hear. With only 48 hours left before the scenario ended, defeating the Tyrant King head-on was impossible. A direct confrontation would only lead to failure. But there was another way. Rather than fighting outright, Dokja would spread false intel. He would give the enemy just enough truth to make them believe in the deception. Sungguk struggled to understand the plan. Spreading false intel. How would that even work? Dokja grinned. They would make text copies of 6S grade Infinite Regressor and distribute them strategically. By doing so, they would disguise it as part of the revelation the prophets had received. In a battle where multiple enemies existed, the best solution was to turn them against each other. Minsub hesitated, uncertain of how they would create the text copy. Without remembering the exact details of the novel, fabricating something convincing seemed impossible. However, Dokja had already considered this problem and turned to Pildu, requesting his laptop. Pildu reluctantly handed it over, muttering a warning to be careful with it. Dokja barely acknowledged the concern. There was no need to remember a plagiarized novel when the original story was already known. That alone was enough to construct something believable. The realization settled in for Minsub and Sungguk. The plan was straightforward. Two key figures relied on the early chapters of Ways of Survival, the fake author who had plagiarized it and the Tyrant King who was using the prophets for their revelations. One sought to control all information while the other desperately wanted more. The best course of action was to pit them against each other. Dokja began detailing the necessary information. He expanded on the novel's early plot and inserted details about specific items, ensuring they would be tempting enough to lure both the fake author and the Tyrant King into action. With the laptop in place, the writing began. Minsub struggled. Unfamiliar with the process of crafting a narrative, he found himself overwhelmed, his lack of experience making even the simplest sentences difficult to construct. Frustration built quickly, and the difficulty of the task left him with newfound respect for professional authors. Dokja remained focused. There was no need for unnecessary effort. This was not about writing a real novel. The only objective was to create something that looked authentic enough to serve as bait. The details only needed to be convincing, and the characters could be modified as needed. Yet one concern lingered in Dokja's mind. If people like Hyunzong or Jihei learned too much too soon, the consequences could be unpredictable. The truth, that their world was merely a story, was something they would have to face eventually, but now was not the right time. Before he could voice his concern, Minsub unexpectedly addressed it. He and Sungguk had already been testing reactions by telling different people that their world was part of a novel. Each time, the response had been the same. No one could comprehend the idea. It was as if they were NPCs in a game, unable to process the concept even when it was directly explained. No matter how seriously the claim was made, others simply dismissed it as a joke. Dokja had not anticipated this revelation. Minsub explained further, realizing that this was how the first disciple could determine if someone was a prophet. This was also likely the reason the information was called a revelation in the first place. Dokja considered the implications. He turned the discussion toward a deeper question. What was the difference between the characters of Ways of Survival and those who now lived in this world? Sungguk responded instinctively, stating that they were real people, while the others were just fictional characters from a novel. But if that were true, then when had the real world ended and the novel's world begun? If the transition had occurred at the start of the first scenario, what did that mean for those who had existed before it? The question remained unresolved. Dokja knew that Minsub and Sungguk had been outsiders to the novel's story, just like himself. At the beginning, he had been unable to view their information through the character list, but not long after, their profiles had been updated, allowing him to see their details as if they were part of the system. Did that mean they had now become characters? If everyone eventually became part of the system, what determined who was a character and who wasn't? His gaze shifted momentarily to Sanga and Gilyong. There was only one way to confirm. Activating his skill, he attempted to view their character profiles. The result reassured him. No information appeared for either of them. Gilyong, noticing his stare, asked if something was wrong. Dokja dismissed the thought, brushing off the concern. Just then, Minsub called out, having completed the fabricated text. He presented it to Dokja, waiting for approval. Taking over the laptop, Dokja scanned the content. It was good, at least good enough for its purpose. If it had been serialized as an actual novel, it wouldn't have lasted long, but that wasn't important right now. With everything prepared, the next step was to spread the rumor. Word needed to get out that the revelation had been leaked. Minsub hesitated, questioning whether they had enough time to make an impact. Dokja had already accounted for that. The process would be much faster with the right help. He planned to contact Han Dong-hoon. With Dong-hoon's basement dweller attribute, spreading the rumor wouldn't take long at all. Minsub raised a concern about the stations without an internet connection. Spreading the rumor digitally would be effective, but it wouldn't reach everyone. Dokja had already considered this issue. There was someone perfectly suited for the task. At that moment, Kang Il-hun stepped forward. Confidently, he declared himself the right man for the job. His attribute, Rumors Expert, would be invaluable. If anyone could spread false information quickly and convincingly, it was him. The clock was ticking. Only 44 hours remained until the scenario ended. By the next day, the real battle would begin. There was no room for hesitation. Dokja laid out their objective. Within the next 40 hours, they had to take control of Changsan Station. Failure would mean the destruction of their group. The weight of the situation settled over everyone, but there was no time for fear. Hee-won responded without hesitation. Nothing had ever been easy for them. One more impossible fight made no difference. She wanted to know who their next enemy was. Dokja explained. Their opponent was the Tyrant King, one of the 7 kings of Seoul. He ruled over the largest territory in northern Seoul. His rule was brutal. Those he found beautiful were taken as concubines, while the rest were either killed or enslaved. Hee-won's gaze sharpened as she processed the information. A smirk followed as she turned to Dokja. If that was how the Tyrant King chose his victims, then Dokja himself might end up as a slave. Dokja met her gaze without missing a beat. The same could be said about her. Hee-won scoffed at the thought. Becoming a concubine was not an option. There was an easier solution. Why not simply kill the Tyrant King? Dokja dismissed the idea. It wouldn't be that simple. Their opponent had a powerful supporting constellation. A direct confrontation would be too dangerous. There were only 2 viable options. They could either take the Tyrant King's flag, stripping him of his authority, or they could attack his headquarters at Dobong Station. However, before making any moves, they would first head toward Gwanghwamun. Hee-won questioned the plan. If they were going to fight, why wait instead of taking the initiative? But Dokja had already set things in motion. The enemy would come to them. He had leaked specific intel that would draw their interest. Since it would take some time for them to arrive, their group needed to use the time to prepare. Just as he finished speaking, a series of notifications appeared on his phone. Items were being sold in the auction house. His phone buzzed repeatedly, signaling unexpected developments. Sanga noticed the change in his expression and asked what was happening. Dokja realized that things were progressing much faster than he had anticipated. Checking his messages, he saw a new update from Dong-hoon. Dong-hoon had already spread the rumor that the revelation could be purchased through the auction house. The plan was moving forward smoothly. Dokja thanked Dong-hoon for his help. In response, Dong-hoon brushed it off, claiming he was simply repaying a favor. Dokja hadn't given away the files for free. Information had to hold value to be believed. If he had simply distributed them without a cost, people might have doubted their authenticity. At that moment, an incredulous voice filled the air. Baehyong, the dokkaebi, was in shock. He demanded to know if Dokja had the conman attribute. The sheer effectiveness of the plan had caught him off guard. Instead of responding, Dokja asked about the constellation's reactions. Baehyong reported that they were excited, so much so that the chat filters had been partially lifted. The deception was working. Dokja considered the situation carefully. If the files had been spread indiscriminately, the wrong people might have gotten hold of them. Instead, selling them made the information seem more credible. Anyone desperate for the revelation would willingly pay for it. Even incarnations had begun gifting the files to their supporting constellations. The demand was higher than expected. Baehyong pointed out the risk. By spreading this knowledge, Dokja was sharing something only he should have known. Wouldn't this make things more difficult for him? Dokja had already accounted for this. The people willing to buy the files were the ones who already had powerful supporting constellations. They were the ones who needed the information most. Within a short time, 16 volumes of 6S grade infinite regressor had been sold through the exchange. Dokja received received a total of 16,000 coins. The plan had worked better than expected. Dokja turned to the group and made his decision. He was going to rest. Despite the urgency of their situation, he understood the importance of conserving energy for what was to come. Heewon couldn't believe his attitude. While everyone else was tense, he was casually deciding to take a nap. Senga, however, silently placed a thin blanket over him as he lay down. Heewon still found it absurd, questioning what was wrong with him. Closing his eyes, Dokja activated Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint. He had learned that this skill was divided into 3 levels. At level 1, he could read a character's basic emotions and desires. At level 2, he could hear their thoughts. At level 3, he could enter their bodies and experience the world from their perspective. But activating the highest level required 2 conditions. His consciousness had to be unstable, and both he and the character had to be thinking about each other. Somewhere else, Kang Il-hun stood in an isolated area, muttering to himself as he stared into the air. He had already spread rumors to the Tyrant King, but as he waited, he questioned whether his message had even been received. Frustration crept into his voice. He wasn't sure if his words had reached their target. Moments later, Dokja's perspective shifted. His consciousness latched onto Il-hun, and the scene before him changed. In a grand hall, a man sat on an ornate throne, adorned with a magnificent crown and a heavy coat. His posture exuded dominance, his presence commanding. This was the Tyrant King. A subordinate stood before him, delivering a report. The revelation had been obtained, and according to the information, it seemed legitimate. A significant number of coins had been spent to secure it. The Tyrant King demanded to know who had made the copies available. The subordinate speculated that it was likely one of the disciples. Skepticism flickered in the Tyrant King's gaze. He needed assurance. He asked about the credibility of the information. The subordinate confirmed that they had already checked the hidden pieces mentioned in the revelation, and everything aligned with reality. A deep, rumbling laughter erupted from the Tyrant King. Satisfaction gleamed in his eyes as he made his decision. He would personally lead his forces to Gwanghwamun and take control of the station before anyone else could. Dokja observed the scene with silent satisfaction. The Tyrant King had taken the bait. One of the major threats was now in motion. Dokja considered Minsub's movements. The timing was perfect. Minsub had already made his way to Sejong University and was now advancing toward Gwanghwamun. Everything was aligning as planned. Looking around at the surrounding landscape, Minsub noticed something. A group had arrived. Among them, a figure in a black hoodie stood out. There was no doubt about it. That was him. Dokja's thoughts sharpened. The fake author had made his move. This was exactly as expected. The most important hidden piece for the 3rd regression was in Gwanghwamun, and now the fake author had no choice but to head there in a hurry. He was backed into a corner. Minsub observed the situation more closely and noticed something concerning. It wasn't just the fake author. Others were gathering. Kings from Yeongdongpo, Yongsan, and even Seongdong-gu were present. The situation was escalating, and the numbers were growing. If things continued like this, it would be difficult to handle. But this was exactly what Dokja had wanted. The ones who had been hiding in the shadows were now stepping forward. There was no need to seek them out individually. They were gathering in one place, saving time and effort. The moment was approaching. The 4th scenario was reaching its conclusion, and soon, the real war of kings would begin. Dokja's consciousness slowly began to rise. His senses shifted back to reality as Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint deactivated. A deep exhaustion settled over him, and pain spread through his body. His muscles ached from the strain. Level 3 took too much energy to maintain. It wasn't something he could use for extended periods. There were no additional skill gains this time either. The realization was disappointing. It seemed that bonus abilities only came when he entered a first-person perspective of a main character. The mechanics of this power were still unclear to him, and the unpredictability frustrated him. Heewon noticed his movements and spoke as he stirred awake. She had been observing him while he slept, remarking that he had been talking about his mom in his sleep. Dokja's mind raced as he processed what she had heard, but perhaps it was just a reflection of his concerns. His mother's safety had been lingering in his thoughts. He wasn't sure if Heewon was joking or being serious, but there was no time to dwell on it. There was something more important to discuss. Dokja made a request. He didn't want Heewon to participate in the battle at Gwanghwamun. With that decision made, the next step was clear. The division of roles had to be finalized. Some would remain in Cheongmuro, while others would proceed to Gwanghwamun. Dokja made the final decision regarding the group's formation. Pildu and Hyunsung would stay behind to guard Chungmuro. Pildu reacted with indifference, as if he had already anticipated the decision. However, Hyunsung's expression was different. His face was slightly pale, showing clear disappointment. Dokja reassured him there was no reason for Hyunsung to feel discouraged. For now, his task was to refine his skills. There would come a time when his strength would be crucial, and Dokja would need him when that moment arrived. Hyunsung acknowledged the words and stood at attention, accepting his assignment without further protest. With the group divided, the journey to Gwanghwamun began. Hyunsung and Pildu remained behind, tasked with fortifying the defenses. Heewon was also given a mission of her own, separating her from the main group. The core team moving forward consisted of Senga, Gilyong, and Sungguk. Aside from Jihae and Junghyuk, who acted on their own and could not be controlled, these members would play the key roles in the next phase. As the group set off, the remaining Chungmuro members gathered to see them off. Their voices rang out with encouragement, calling out to Senga in particular. She had already become a figure of admiration, despite stepping into this role only a few days ago. Dokja took note of her influence. She had adapted quickly, proving herself capable even under extreme circumstances. Senga, however, seemed unsure. She questioned whether she would truly be useful on this mission. Compared to Hyunsung and Heewon, she doubted her capabilities. Dokja assured her that his decisions were never made at random. If she was accompanying him, it was because she possessed something others did not. She had a specific skill that would be essential for this mission. He reminded her of her background, her certification in Korean history. Her mood shifted instantly. There was a spark of excitement as she confirmed her qualification. Realizing where this was going, Dokja reminded her of the items he had previously obtained from the statue of the great monk Samyang. More relics like those would be scattered along the path to Gwanghwamun, especially with the presence of historical monuments and the National Museum in that direction. Senga quickly understood there had to be other ruins and relics imbued with the power of constellations. If they could find and collect them, their strength would increase significantly. Dokja confirmed her thoughts. This was her mission. She would be responsible for locating such items along the way. With determination in her voice, Senga promised to do her best. She would recall as much information as possible and help identify valuable relics. Dokja emphasized the importance of this task. Their numbers were too few compared to their enemies. If they wanted any chance of survival, they had to maximize their resources. Dokja analyzed the situation carefully. The Tyrant King would have his incarnations gathered under his command, while the fake author would also have a considerable number of followers. The later half of the fourth scenario was essentially a proxy war between the high-ranking constellations. In this kind of battlefield, knowledge of history would be a valuable weapon. Senga's expertise in the subject would prove essential. Senga pondered for a moment before recalling a possible location. There was a shrine nearby that could hold lingering spiritual power. She was unsure if her memory was accurate, but if they passed by the area, it would be worth investigating. However, the shrine in question did not honor a South Korean figure. This caught Dokja's attention. As a devoted reader of ways of survival, he had no recollection of a place called Gwangsengmyo. Despite this, he decided to follow Senga's lead. If her instincts were right, they might uncover something useful. The group moved according to her directions, advancing through the city streets. After some time, an exclamation came from Sungguk. He had spotted something ahead. To everyone's surprise, an old shrine truly stood before them. Gwangsengmyo. Dokja observed the structure with curiosity. A shrine dedicated to one of China's greatest generals, hidden in the middle of Seoul, was an unexpected discovery. Senga turned to him for guidance. Uncertain of what their next move should be, Dokja considered their options. What had worked with the great monk Samyang might not apply here. However, there was no harm in trying the simplest approach. Instead of forcing anything, they would pay their respects. The group quietly gathered water from the shrine and performed a prayer, showing their reverence. The air remained still for a few moments, and then, without warning, a system message appeared. A neglected shrine had been visited for the first time in a long while. A constellation, one who wielded a crescent blade, was pleased by their presence. The being revealed its title, Lord of the Beautiful Beard, and in response to their respect, bestowed a blessing upon them. For the next 24 hours, their stamina and strength would each increase by 5. Sungguk reacted with excitement. Their luck had turned in their favor. Dokja processed the information. The Lord of the Beautiful Beard was a well-known figure. Despite being a Chinese general, every Korean was familiar with him. This shrine honored Guan Yu, a deified warrior from the Three Kingdoms period. It was unusual to find a shrine dedicated to him in the heart of Seoul, but given his historical significance, it was not entirely unthinkable. Senga assessed the outcome. The visit had yielded a beneficial blessing, but it seemed unlikely that they would find any relics or artifacts here. Still, it was a good start. Sungguk sighed in disappointment, hoping for something as powerful as Guan Yu's legendary Green Dragon Crescent blade, but before anyone could dwell on it, Gilyong's cockroach began twitching violently in his grasp. His sudden cry sent a wave of alertness through the group. Dokja and the others immediately turned in the direction of the disturbance. A group was approaching from a distance, 50 individuals moving in an organized formation. Their movements were disciplined, their presence commanding. The average strength of their physical bodies was around level 40. While they weren't as formidable as the apostles, their sheer number and coordination made them an elite force. Leading them meant only one thing: a warlord had arrived. Sungguk studied them carefully, his gaze tracing over their armor. There was something oddly familiar about their appearance. The thought gnawed at him until realization set in. The intricate designs, the way they carried themselves, it felt almost like a theatrical production. But at a time like this, was a movie shoot even possible? His confusion deepened as his eyes landed on the man at the forefront. The resemblance was uncanny. Shengmin Huang. The thought felt absurd, yet the proof was right in front of him. The entire group looked as if they had stepped straight out of a historical reenactment. One of the warriors stepped forward, raising his spear with authority. His stance was rigid, his presence unwavering. The air around him demanded recognition. He was looking directly at Dokja, as if expecting an answer. Dokja remained composed, assessing the situation. He had his suspicions about the man's identity, but he waited for confirmation. Before a response could be given, another voice emerged from the gathered warriors. It carried a sharp curiosity, laced with subtle amusement. The woman speaking had fixed her gaze on the brown flag in Dokja's possession. There was no mistaking what she was implying. She had recognized the flag's significance and was questioning whether he too was a king. Sungguk stiffened as recognition struck once more. A name surfaced in his mind: Jiwoon Min. The weight of familiarity was undeniable. The realization left him stunned, and without thinking, he stepped forward. A rush of admiration filled his expression. He was captivated, as if under an unseen influence. Dokja moved swiftly. His personal skill, Dispel, activated the moment he locked eyes with Sungguk. In an instant, the enchantment shattered. As he observed the unfolding events, Dokja analyzed the situation. Sungguk prided himself on his abilities as a hypnotist, yet even he had been affected so easily. If Sungguk recognized Jiwoon Min, then this wasn't just an ordinary individual. The title King of Beauty surfaced in Dokja's memory. Among the 7 kings of Seoul in Ways of Survival, one had been given that very name. The resemblance, the aura, the commanding presence, it all aligned too well. This was not a coincidence. Dokja opened Min Ji-woon's character profile, confirming his suspicions. She was indeed a character from Ways of Survival, but something didn't add up. If she was a character from the novel, how did Sungguk recognize her? Sungguk wasn't a character himself, yet he had reacted with clear familiarity. The inconsistency nagged at him, but he set it aside for now. Maintaining composure, Dokja acknowledged Min Ji-woon's presence with measured respect. She responded with a lighthearted curiosity, gauging his reaction. The exchange played out like a well-rehearsed dance, but Dokja wasn't interested in flattery. His knowledge extended far beyond admiration. He addressed her with the weight of what he knew, recognizing not just her influence in the present, but the deeper forces at play. The air around them shifted as a notification flickered in Dokja's vision. The message confirmed what he had anticipated. Min Ji-woon's supporting constellation had been startled. His words had struck a nerve. The revelation lingered between them, unspoken but heavy with meaning. Dokja noted her silence, reading it as confirmation. His mind processed the information swiftly. Lady of the Spring Brocade. The name resonated with history. Queen Jinsung, the last ruler of unified Sela. This wasn't the first time he had encountered such a phenomenon in Ways of Survival. When an incarnation and their supporting constellation shared an overwhelming connection, the boundaries between them blurred. The constellations, driven by unresolved ambitions, could impose their unfulfilled desires upon their incarnations, and often the incarnations remained unaware of the danger. The weight of another's past could crush them if things spiraled out of control. Dokja mentally aligned this with the larger conflict unfolding in Seoul. If the novel's events were still in motion, then 3 districts, Cheongdong-gu, Yongsan-gu, and Yeongdongpo-gu, were locked in a brutal struggle. Their battle mirrored the chaos of Korea's later Three Kingdoms period. The pattern was unmistakable. As he analyzed the situation, another system message abruptly appeared before him. The words carried an air of finality. A new bounty scenario had arrived. Dokja's eyes remained fixed on the scenario window, his thoughts momentarily pausing. The timing was too precise, too deliberate. He barely had time to register the implications before Jiwoon, still composed, sent him a slow, knowing smile. Jiwoon's Ji-woon's demeanor shifted as she delivered her offer, her voice carrying the weight of both confidence and authority. She spoke with the assurance of a ruler, relaying the will of her supporting constellation. A test of sincerity had been issued. The War of Kings was inevitable, and only those who aligned with the strongest forces would survive. She didn't know which constellation supported Dokja, but she made it clear that the smaller groups in the region would be eliminated. She presented a single option. Joining her side was the only path to survival. Before she could finish, Dokja refused without hesitation. The abruptness of his rejection sent a shock through Ji-woon. Her composure wavered as disbelief flickered across her face. She demanded an explanation, her voice laced with incredulity. The offer wasn't insignificant. 2,000 coins was a substantial sum. She pressed further, increasing the stakes, insisting that he understand the value of what she was offering. But Dokja remained unmoved. He dismissed the offer outright, seeing through the power play. Ji-woon's frustration deepened. Her expression darkened as she proclaimed her title with renewed determination. She was the Queen of Scylla. She would soon unite the fractured territories and reign supreme. In her mind, it wasn't Dokja who held the leverage, it was her. If anything, he should be the one paying for the privilege of joining her ranks. Before tensions could escalate further, Senga stepped forward. Her voice was measured, respectful yet firm. She addressed Ji-woon directly, offering a historical perspective that challenged the grandiose claims. By all accounts, Scylla had been the weakest among the three kingdoms. The question hung in the air: how did Ji-woon intend to overcome such an inherent disadvantage? Ji-woon's composure cracked at the unexpected challenge. Her voice rose as she lashed out, demanding to know what Senga thought she understood about history. Senga hesitated briefly before stating her credentials. She possessed a first-grade certificate in Korean history. The weight of the statement lingered. Ji-woon faltered. Her bravado wavered, momentarily thrown off balance. She scoffed, attempting to dismiss the qualification, but the initial impact had already settled in. Dokja turned away, signaling for Senga to follow. The conversation had run its course. Ji-woon's grasp of history was flawed, and there was no reason to linger. As they began to walk away, Ji-woon called after them with increasing desperation. The offer rose, 3,000 coins, then 3,500. The desperation in her voice became more apparent with each number. Dokja remained indifferent. He knew the scale of Ji-woon's capital, understood the hierarchy of wealth among constellations. The disparity in resources was clear, but none of it mattered. Without a second glance, he ignored the calls behind him and continued forward. When Ji-woon rose her offer to 3,700, Dokja stopped walking, releasing a small sigh. Ji-woon's confidence surged as she assumed she had finally convinced him, but instead of accepting her offer, he proposed a counteroffer of his own. He named a price, 10,000 coins. Ji-woon hesitated, the number catching her off guard. Her composure wavered as she repeated the amount, barely believing what she had heard. Before she could process it, Dokja doubled the figure. He offered 20,000 coins. Ji-woon's expression twisted in disbelief. The suggestion sounded absurd. She demanded to know if he was serious, questioning whether he truly believed he was worth such a sum. But Dokja clarified the intent behind his offer. He wasn't pricing himself, he was pricing her. He was offering 20,000 coins to buy her and all of her men. A stunned silence followed. Ji-woon's mouth hung open, her usual confident demeanor shattered. Then, with a simple snap of his fingers, 20,000 coins materialized before her. The sheer amount of wealth on display left her momentarily dazed. Her attempt to maintain a composed expression failed completely. Dokja made his stance clear. Just because she lacked the means to match his offer didn't mean others did as well. The proof was in front of her. He assured her that even greater wealth was at his disposal. But more importantly, he reminded her that not everything in the world could be solved with money. As an actress, she should have understood this better than anyone. His voice carried a note of disappointment. Senga observed the scene before turning to Dokja. Her curiosity shifted to the man standing beside Ji-woon. She asked if he could be the incarnation of Guanchang. Dokja acknowledged the possibility. Guanchang had been a legendary Hwarang warrior who perished in the Battle of Hwangsan-beol. His abilities might not have been extraordinary, but his unwavering loyalty to his kingdom made him formidable. Senga's attention then moved back to Ji-woon. She seemed puzzled. Unlike Dokja and Sungguk, she did not recognize Ji-woon. This discrepancy stood out. If she were a well-known celebrity, surely Senga would have at least heard of her, but she hadn't. Her tone carried a trace of relief as she noted that even Gil-young was unfamiliar with her. Dokja considered the implications. If Ji-woon was a character from the novel, then it made sense that Senga and Gil-young wouldn't recognize her, but something remained strange. Sungguk's recognition of Ji-woon raised a troubling question in Dokja's mind. It made no sense. Sungguk had claimed to be a fan of hers, even calling her a famous actress, but something felt off. Dokja called him over, questioning him about his familiarity with Ji-woon. At first, Sungguk responded with with certainty, reaffirming that she was indeed a well-known actress. But as he spoke, his expression shifted. Confusion clouded his face as his words trailed off. Doubt crept into his voice. He repeated her name as if testing its familiarity, as if the knowledge had always been there, but was suddenly unfamiliar. He hesitated, questioning whether he had truly known her all along. Dokja immediately checked Sungook's character profile. What he found shocked him. The ninth renouncer attribute had vanished. Instead, Sungook had now become a character. The implications were heavy. There were still 35 hours left until the scenario ended, and something fundamental had changed. Renouncers were those who had read Ways of Survival and knew the future. However, Sungook only knew the earlier chapters of the novel. That meant the scenario had now progressed beyond what he had read. If a renouncer reached this point of uncertainty, did they inevitably turn into characters? A sudden system message disrupted his thoughts. Jiwon had developed an attraction toward him. The absurdity of the notification made him freeze for a moment. He instinctively turned his gaze toward her. She stood still in the distance, staring at him. Though her face wasn't visible from this angle, her posture and rigid movements radiated frustration. Then another realization struck him. He had forgotten something. A crucial detail from the novel resurfaced in his mind. In the 11th regression, Jiwon had slapped Junghyuk upon their first meeting. Yet after that, she had chosen to support him throughout that entire regression. The pieces clicked together, and an ominous feeling settled in his chest. He could only hope he was wrong. An hour later, the group moved swiftly through the forest of abandoned buildings near Gwanghwamun. There were no visible signs of people, but Dokja knew better. The kings who had purchased his texts were lurking nearby, waiting for their moment to strike. The city was growing increasingly dangerous, and every step forward heightened the tension. As they approached the entrance of the National Palace Museum of Korea, Dokja's pulse quickened. His eyes skimmed the text before him, his heart beating faster with each word. The artifacts within the museum were largely insignificant, mere remnants of the past. But among them, a single treasure lay hidden, an item of immeasurable value, the 4-yin demon decapitator, the most valuable 6S grade item in all of Gwanghwamun. Dokja couldn't help but acknowledge the dramatic writing that had described this scene in Ways of Survival. The way it was built up, the weight of its presence. It was exaggerated, yet strangely compelling. Sungook chuckled in response. His excitement was clear, but Dokja remained unimpressed. That wasn't a compliment. Gilyoung's curiosity grew as he considered the potential of the 4-yin demon decapitator. If the weapon truly existed, securing it before the others seemed like the most logical step. However, Dokja remained still, choosing not to act just yet. He analyzed the situation. While there was no such thing as an 6S grade item, the 4-yin demon decapitator was still an exceptionally powerful sword. Junghyuk himself had wielded it in his third regression, proving its worth in battle. Naturally, anyone who had seen the revelation they had spread would pursue it without hesitation. That was precisely what Dokja wanted. As the inevitable rush toward the sword began, their group would seize the opportunity to collect the remaining relics. The others would be too distracted fighting over the decapitator, allowing them to move undisturbed. The moment their enemies made their move, Dokja's group would execute their plan. Before they could act, an abrupt shift in the air signaled the return of an unwelcome presence. The mid-level dokkaebi materialized once again, his usual expression of amusement evident as he surveyed the gathered competitors. With a theatrical tone, he addressed the situation, making it clear that those who had come together deserved a reward. Then, something massive began to rise. From the very heart of Gwanghwamun, a structure emerged, bathed in golden light. The sheer brilliance of it cast long shadows across the battlefield, drawing the attention of every person present. It was a throne, regal and commanding. Its presence radiating authority. Gasps filled the air. No explanation was needed. Every so-called ruler in the area understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Only one person could claim that throne. A system message confirmed what had just occurred. The next phase of the scenario had begun. The fourth main scenario had been activated. Sungook processed the update with growing concern. They were already struggling to secure the necessary strongholds for Capture the Flag, and now an entirely new objective had been introduced. Their current progress was insufficient. If they couldn't keep up, they would be left behind. The dokkaebi, seemingly aware of their unease, exuded a sense of satisfaction. He assured them that this scenario would allow ample time. Unlike the frantic rush of the previous one, there was no need to hurry, at least not yet. Then the conditions were revealed. Claiming the throne wasn't simply a matter of sitting upon it. Only those who could prove their qualifications would be allowed to challenge for its rule. A system message confirmed the first requirement. The throne would only accept a ruler who was braver than anyone else. Weakness had no place in this contest. To even attempt claiming the seat of power, a competitor needed to possess at least one black flag. Dokja assessed the situation, his mind racing with calculation. populations. The requirement for the black flag posed a major obstacle. They still needed to occupy 10 more stations, but there were no vacant locations left nearby. That was the whole point of the condition. No one at this stage had a black flag yet, making it an intentional roadblock for all contenders. He recalled an alternative method. Flags weren't just obtained by territory expansion. There were other ways to change a flag's color. That realization struck his companions as well. There was only one viable option left, taking another group leader's flag by force. The air grew tense as people processed the implications. The sound of weapons being drawn echoed through the battlefield, accompanied by the shuffling of feet as individuals formed battle lines. Chaos erupted as factions clashed. Those vying for promotion now fought with lethal intent, real blades flashing in the dim light. Others, seeking to expand their influence, began targeting rival stations, aiming to seize control. The objective was simple: kill to obtain better weapons, eliminate enemies to ensure survival. War had begun. Dokja remained composed, making the call to head west. Unlike the main battlefield near the Northern Palace Museum, the western sector had fewer competitors. Most of the so-called kings were drawn to the museum, seeking its treasures, leaving the western stations less contested. Sunguk, observing the carnage unfolding around them, couldn't hide his unease. The sight of fellow survivors turning on each other so ruthlessly made him question whether they were still in Korea at all. But reality was clear. This was Korea, or at least something that barely resembled it anymore. Fear still lingered. Even for Dokja, the weight of survival pressed down. Whether as an ordinary salaryman or a struggling survivor in ways of survival, death was an inevitable end. The only difference lay in how one chose to live before that moment arrived. As long as he focused on the path ahead, moving forward with unwavering resolve, he could keep pushing through. And right now, his instincts told him he was on the right path. Leading his party, Dokja navigated through the battlefield, avoiding unnecessary engagements. The west was less populated, but not entirely devoid of danger. Eventually, their journey brought them to a location facing Gyeonghoi Palace, the Seoul History Museum. Inside the museum, Senga questioned what exactly they needed to find. Dokja explained that they were searching for a ganpyeongui, a disc-shaped relic from the Joseon era. The urgency of the situation made it clear that they needed to split up to locate it faster. He assigned Gil-young to move with Senga, preparing to direct Sunguk as well. But before he could finish speaking, something cut through the air behind him. Instinct took over as he crouched, yanking his party members down with him. A sharp impact followed, an arrow embedding itself into the museum's exterior wall. Faint traces of magical power shimmered along the shaft, confirming that the attack wasn't ordinary. Magic-infused arrows. The enemy wasn't just some random survivor. Whoever they were, they had skill. A voice rang out across the area as a group of men emerged from the distance, armed with bows and swords. Dokja's gaze sharpened as he accessed the attacker's character profile. The name displayed as Wangin Chu, a bit part actor. The man's booming voice carried exaggerated confidence, calling out to demand Dokja's flag in exchange for his life. His manner of speaking was theatrical, almost laughable, but there was real danger beneath his bravado. Dokja quickly pieced things together. This was the last hero of Hwangsun Beol, an incarnation bearing the power of General Gyabake. It was almost tragic that such a powerful legacy had ended up with someone like him. Still, he was far from weak. His high stigma level made him a formidable opponent. Fighting him head-on would be difficult without an increase in stats. But spending coins here would be a waste. Every last one was needed for the final phase. Before he could settle on a course of action, another arrow struck, this time piercing his thigh. A sharp, burning pain shot through his leg. The situation was deteriorating fast. Perhaps sparing 20,000 coins was necessary. Given the number of enemies, handling them all without increasing his stats would be impossible. But before he could act, another voice cut through the air. Dokja's attention snapped toward the approaching figure. A woman strode forward with a regal presence, her gaze fixed on the battlefield. Recognition hit instantly. Jawon, the king of beauty. Wangin's reaction was immediate, his expression twisting in fury. His voice dripped with frustration at the unexpected arrival, his disdain evident. Jiwon, however, remained unfazed. She responded with cold composure, her tone carrying a quiet, cutting sharpness. Her words struck directly at Wangin's pride, referencing his ruined kingdom with unmistakable contempt. Dokja's thoughts scrambled to process her sudden appearance. Had she followed him? It seemed impossible, but the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Then a system notification flickered before his eyes that the character Jiwon is slightly attracted toward you. A brief moment of disbelief washed over him. Was this really happening? Jiwon's gaze lingered on him before she spoke again. This was not about alliances, not about debts. She was merely here to settle a previous transgression, nothing more. Wangin laughed, his voice carrying arrogance as he mocked Jiwon for interfering interfering in such a minor conflict. He questioned how she could call herself a queen while concerning herself with trivial matters. His words dripped with disdain, but before he could continue, one of Jiwoon's warriors, an incarnation of Hwarang, stepped forward in outrage. The warrior's voice rang out, demanding respect for the queen. Wangen's amusement only grew as he took in the sight of his new opponent. A Hwarang, a warrior who had pledged loyalty to an ancient code, stood before him. He scoffed at the very idea of someone forming a contract with what he considered a weak and insignificant constellation. The insult cut deep as he referenced the fate of Hwarang's constellation, who had been beheaded in history. Wangen taunted the warrior, asking if he wished to meet the same fate. The Hwarang's fury erupted instantly, his voice filled with rage as he snapped back at the insult. But the situation was already unfavorable. Dokja quickly assessed the situation. Jiwoon's intervention was unexpected, but this particular matchup was the worst possible outcome. The historical connection between these figures made the battle far more complicated than it seemed. Hwarang's constellation was Gwanchang, while Wangen's constellation was Gyebek. The two had fought in the Battle of Hwangsan-beol, where Gwanchang was famously executed by Gyebek. Within the world of constellations, a strict hierarchy existed. Figures from history held advantages or disadvantages depending on their past relationships. Generals could not betray their kings, and rivals carried the weight of their real-life struggles. The closer an incarnation aligned with their constellation, the stronger these effects became. This meant that Gyebek's incarnation, Wangen, naturally held an overwhelming advantage over Gwanchang's incarnation, the Hwarang. Dokja understood this well and turned toward Jiwoon. His expression remained unreadable, but his words were certain. She needed to withdraw. There was no chance of victory in this battle. Before Jiwoon could respond, Senga's voice called out from behind. Dokja turned immediately, spotting both Senga and Gilyang as they hurried toward him. Their expressions carried urgency, but there was something else. Success. Senga had found what they were looking for. Dokja's eyes locked onto the object in her hands. The Gampyeonggi recognition struck instantly. This was it, the key to turning the tide. Dokja wasted no time acknowledging Senga's perfect timing. The tides of battle could shift now. A plan began forming in his mind, one based not on brute force, but on history itself. Jiwoon's confusion was evident as she questioned what he meant, but Dokja had already decided their next move. If history dictated their strengths and weaknesses, then history would also dictate their victory. In history, Silla had triumphed over Baekje. The battle had been a decisive one, a clash between the allied forces of Silla and the Tang dynasty, led by the great general Kim Yushin against the Baekje forces commanded by Gyebek. Though Gyebek fought valiantly, his army was overwhelmed. The turning point of that battle had been the sacrifice of the young Hwarang warriors. Their selfless charge had shifted the course of the war, leading to Gyebek's downfall, and now Dokja would make sure history repeated itself. Wangen activated his stigma, command detachment, and immediately gave the order for his forces to charge. His voice rang out with absolute authority, pushing his soldiers forward with unshakable determination. The warriors of Hwarang responded with fierce devotion. Their leader roared a battle cry, declaring that there would be no retreat. They would serve their king with unwavering loyalty, prepared to give their lives if necessary. At that moment, all of Hwarang fell under the influence of the Five Commandments, a powerful force that bound them to their sworn duty. Wangen's expression twisted into a wicked grin as he mocked their resolve. He saw their loyalty as nothing more than foolishness, and commanded his own troops to crush them without mercy. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Wangen activated Baekje swordsmanship, and his forces charged with terrifying force. The air was filled with a deafening roar as the two groups clashed, steel meeting steel in a brutal struggle for dominance. Dokja knew that this battle could not be fought as it was. Allowing Gyebek's incarnation to fight Gwanchang's incarnation would only result in disaster. The historical hierarchy between them was too strong. Gwanchang had fallen to Gyebek before, and if history repeated itself, their side would suffer a crushing defeat. Dokja called for an immediate retreat. Jiwoon hesitated, but quickly followed his order, activating her skill, Military Command. However, her face filled with shock as the skill was instantly cancelled. She gave the retreat order again, but the soldiers no longer responded. They had already fallen into a frenzied state driven by their constellations and the battle's momentum. A chilling scream cut through the battlefield as the Hwarang captain was struck by a massive sword, his body sent flying through the air. Blood splattered across the ground as the relentless battle continued. A notification flickered. The constellation, Lady of the Spring Brocade, is nervous. Dokja gritted his teeth. Gwanchang alone would not be enough to turn the tide, but the battlefield itself had already begun to change. Screams of shock echoed through the area as the air around them shimmered. Sparks of light crackled and the world twisted unnaturally. Within Within moments, the entire landscape had transformed. The streets of Gwanghwamun vanished, replaced by a rugged mountain terrain. The modern world was gone, replaced by the setting of an ancient war. Sungguk's voice wavered as he tried to process what he was seeing. The scenery had changed entirely, as if they had been transported to another time. Dokja remained calm, recognizing what had just happened. This was dramatization, when historically significant incarnations deeply connected to their constellations engaged in battle. The battlefield itself would shift. The world around them would recreate the time and space in which those constellations had once fought. Wangan erupted into laughter, delighted by the transformation. He reveled in the chaos, declaring that it felt good to be back in Hwangsanbeol. The historical battlefield had been fully reconstructed, and he was ready to relive his constellation's final war. Dokja, however, knew the truth. They had not actually traveled back in time. This was an illusion, an augmented reality shaped by the will of the constellations. But the real danger lay in the fact that the incarnations themselves believed it was real. Sungguk watched in shock as Wangan dominated the battlefield. Even without the title of king, his power was overwhelming. Dokja remained calm, explaining the nature of the battlefield. This was a stage created specifically for Gebek. The entire scenario was built around his history, giving him an advantage that made him nearly unstoppable. There were only two ways to shift the battle in their favor. The first option was to allow Guanchang's incarnation to fall in battle. If he died here, it would mirror history exactly, triggering the same effect it had in the past. His sacrifice would ignite the morale of Scylla's troops, pushing them to fight with newfound strength, just as it had happened before. Sungguk struggled to comprehend the idea, his voice filled with disbelief. The thought of letting one of their own die seemed unthinkable, but Dokja remained firm. Dramatization had already begun, and history was unfolding as it once had. The moment Guanchang fell, Scylla's soldiers would fight with the desperate fury that had once led them to victory. Jiwoon listened intently, weighing the risks. There was another option. They could attempt to change history, but the consequences of failure were clear. If they did not succeed, Scylla would fall completely, and there would be no second chance. Her decision was immediate. She roared her answer, choosing the first option without hesitation. She was not willing to gamble the fate of her kingdom on an uncertain outcome. But Dokja had never intended to give her that choice. As he stood at the center of the battlefield, he reached for the Ganpyeonggi, the ancient relic they had searched for. The artifact was composed of two distinct discs, the sky disc and the earth disc. Without hesitation, he began to manipulate the discs, making his choice clear. He had already decided on the second option. Jiwoon's frustration boiled over as she realized what was happening. Her voice rang out in anger, demanding to know why he had even asked her opinion if he had already made his decision. Dokja remained unmoved. He had simply been giving her a chance to see the truth. In this battle, Scylla did not need her leadership, it needed something greater. As he slowly turned the Earth Disk, a powerful reaction rippled through the air. The constellations engraved on the sky disk began to glow with brilliant intensity. A sudden surge of energy pulsed from the relic. Notifications flickered before his eyes that the Ganpyeonggi's special option, Echo of the Stars, has been activated. A deep resonating force spread across the battlefield. The Echo of the Stars allowed him to call upon the aid of a constellation, but it was not a guaranteed salvation. The chosen constellation had the right to refuse his request, and each time the Ganpyeonggi was used, its power would diminish. Dokja analyzed the relic in his hands. The Ganpyeonggi, an astronomical instrument crafted in 17th century Joseon, held far greater significance than many realized. While others sought after the famed 4-yin demon decapitator, this artifact was the true key. It had the power to call upon the stars, to summon a force that could change the course of battle. Determined, Dokja made his choice. The battlefield trembled as his voice carried across the heavens, reaching the distant constellations that watched from above. The great beings who resided among the stars turned their attention to him, their presence felt as the weight of history pressed down upon the land. Wangan's sharp gaze caught the shift in energy. Realizing Dokja's intent, he moved to intervene. His voice cut through the chaos, demanding answers, but before he could act, Sungguk stepped forward. Without hesitation, he positioned himself in defense, his stance unwavering. He would hold the line, shielding Jiwoon from the impending danger. Dokja ignored the growing conflict, his eyes fixed on the vast sky above. The stars shimmered, waiting. He called upon the one who had once led the Hwarang, the hero who had guided Scylla through war. His voice resonated across the battlefield. The heavens responded. A section of the sky darkened, a shadow cascading onto the war-torn land below. The battle between Scylla and Baekje came to a sudden halt. Warriors on both sides frozen by the shift in the air. A presence beyond comprehension loomed over them. Then, among the countless stars, one shone brighter than the rest. A celestial body pulsed with energy, its light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. A notification flickered into existence. The stars have set sail. The great constellation King Hongmu the Great had turned his gaze upon the battlefield. Dokja's mind raced as he processed the overwhelming presence. Yusin Kim, the legendary leader of the Hwarang, had answered his call. Victory seemed within reach, but nothing happened. A second message followed. The constellation King Hongmu the Great had chosen not to interfere. He would not disrupt the established course of history. His silence was absolute, his refusal final. Dokja's confidence wavered. This was not part of the plan. His strategy depended on the Gempyeongi ability to sway history itself. Yet the great warrior who once led Scylla remained unmoved. A sudden desperation filled the air. Then Senga's voice cut through the silence. Though the battlefield was steeped in history, she refused to let the past dictate the present. She called out to the distant constellation, her words carrying across time. She had only read about his achievements, but she understood his legacy. She acknowledged his desire to let history remain untouched. Yet she challenged him. Did the sacrifices of the young Hwarang mean nothing? Had he already forgotten the people of Scylla who had given their lives? A new notification appeared. The constellation, King Hongmu the Great, was listening to Senga. She continued, unwavering. Hwang Sanbeol had long been over for him, but for those standing on this battlefield, it was still unfolding. The past had ended, but the present could still be shaped. The great constellation remained still. His presence loomed over the battlefield, but his eyes were closed, as if deep in thought. Dokja observed the shift, realizing the importance of what had just transpired. Senga had done what he could not. Her ability to communicate, to present an argument with clarity and conviction, had reached a being that had initially refused to listen. He had made the right decision in bringing her along. A powerful shift resonated through the battlefield as King Hongmu the Great finally answered Dokja's call. One of the constellations engraved on the Gempyeongi vanished, and a brilliant light descended from the heavens, striking Dokja. A surge of divine energy coursed through his body, sending violent tremors through his muscles. His heart pounded with overwhelming force, his vision fluctuating between light and darkness. Something ancient, something far greater than himself, was taking shape within him. The presence of the constellation seeped into his being, its very essence pressing against the boundaries of his existence. The voice of the great constellation echoed through him, deep, resonant, and filled with an indescribable weight. This was not just power. This was the lingering memory of a king, the final echoes of a soul burdened by history. The constellation reached out, asking Dokja to lend his voice. There was no hesitation. Dokja opened his eyes. The battlefield of Hwang Sanbeol had gone completely silent. Every warrior, every incarnation had turned their gaze upon him. Hwangin, the incarnation of Gyebek, stood frozen. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at Dokja. His expression caught between shock and something deeper, an emotion that bordered on reverence. Then a voice emerged from Dokja's lips, but it was not his own. A voice filled with centuries of wisdom and sorrow carried across the battlefield. The weight of history was woven into each word, and as the sound reached the ears of the warriors present, something within them stirred. The incarnation of Gwanchang trembled as recognition dawned. The young warrior staggered, his body trembling under the sheer force of the presence before him. The Hwarang knew this voice. He had never heard it in his lifetime, but his soul remembered. Dokja was no longer just himself. King Hongmu the Great was looking through his eyes, his presence intertwined with Dokja's consciousness. The world as it was, the war-torn battlefield, the ruined soul, became visible to the ancient king. And through King Hongmu the Great, Dokja too saw the world from a perspective long lost to time. Hwangin, overwhelmed by the turn of events, erupted into laughter. His voice rang through the battlefield, wild and filled with reckless joy. He welcomed the chaos. As if answering this madness, a new force descended upon the battlefield. The constellation, last hero of Hwang Sanbeol, took possession of his incarnation, fully manifesting through Hwangin's body. The past and present were colliding in ways no one could have anticipated. Dokja, no, King Hongmu the Great, turned his gaze toward Gyebek's incarnation. Sorrow lingered in his expression, a deep understanding passing between them. His voice carried across the battlefield once more, declaring his name, his legacy, and his resolve. He was Yusin Kim, the 15th leader of the Hwarang. He would honor the fallen and correct the course of history. In response to his declaration, the power of the constellation artifact, Blue Dragon's sword, flowed into unbreakable faith. The blade of the Blue Dragon sword rose high into the sky above Hwang San, its power shaking the very land. The air trembled as an overwhelming force surged outward, and a deep fissure split the ground beneath Dokja. Dokja. The stigma, gather the Hwarang activated. From within the crack, something long buried began to stir. Forgotten ghosts, warriors lost to history, awakened once more. Though their names had faded, they were the Hwarang, warriors who had once lived and fought for honor on this land. A low, haunting roar echoed as the Dragonflower Tree, Kim Yushin's elite unit, emerged from the past. The spectral soldiers rose from the earth, their skeletal forms draped in tattered remnants of armor. Some had no eyes, others were missing limbs, but all carried the resolve of those who had fought to defend their kingdom. They had once died to protect Scylla, and now they rose again to fight for what was already lost. The battlefield descended into chaos as Baekje's forces clashed with the spectral warriors. Blades tore through flesh, soldiers coughed blood, and the echoes of a war long past resounded once more. Dokja watched as Wangan, the incarnation of Gyebek, faced the wrath of the vengeful spirits. Spears thrust forward, piercing his chest, their spectral tips emerging from his back. The sheer force sent shockwaves through his body, but still, Gyebek endured. Dokja assessed the situation. Gyebek seemed too deeply immersed in his incarnation, his actions defying the natural balance of this world. The overwhelming power he exerted came at a cost, one he was willing to pay. Gyebek's presence on this battlefield held a deep, unspoken sorrow. The fate of history had always denied him the fight he sought. The records showed that in all their previous battles, Gyebek had never lost to Kim Yushin until Hwangsanbeol, and in that final decisive battle, Kim Yushin had deliberately avoided facing him in direct combat. Senga, witnessing the unfolding events, began to understand. History had not granted Gyebek the battle he desired. His longing, his resentment, and his regret all condensed into this moment. Even in this fabricated battlefield, he reached for a duel that had never been allowed. Dokja recognized the truth behind Kim Yushin's tactics. People might call him a coward for avoiding a head-on fight, but that very pragmatism was what had led him to victory. Yushin's blade advanced toward Gyebek, the weight of history pressing down upon the battlefield. At the last moment, Dokja withdrew his voice, halting the execution. The King of No Killing Oath bound him, preventing him from carrying out direct slaughter. If he were to personally take a life, he would lose his throne. Understanding this, Kim Yushin acknowledged Dokja's limitations. With a mere gesture, he summoned one of the Dragonflower Tree warriors. The soldier stepped forward, the silent understanding of duty passing between them. The execution had to be completed, but Dokja's hands would remain clean. The warrior's blade moved with precision. Gyebek's incarnation barely had time to react before the sword sliced through the air, severing his head from his body. The execution was swift, the conclusion of a battle centuries in the making. The incarnation's head fell, his presence dissipating like the remnants of a lost era. Notifications flickered across Dokja's vision, marking the end of the staged transformation. The Battle of Hwangsanbeol had concluded. 1,000 coins were earned as experience compensation. Looking around, Dokja saw that Baekje's forces had been completely wiped out. The authority of the King of No Killing remained intact due to the indirect nature of Gyebek's demise. The party members rushed toward Dokja, but there was no time to linger. The battle was over, yet the war was far from finished. The remaining forces needed to be dealt with, and the flags, symbols of control in the current scenario, had to be collected. The scattered remnants of the Dragonflower Tree warriors surged forward, sweeping through the streets, dismantling smaller enemy factions. The sound of steel against steel echoed through the ruins, the battlefield still alive with chaos. Dozens of flags lay abandoned in the aftermath of Wangan's downfall. The fourth main scenario had clear conditions. The ruler's throne in the heart of Gwanghwamun had to be occupied. The king who claimed that seat would wield absolute command over the others. As the dust settled, Songguk took in the sight of the abandoned flags. The opportunity was clear. They could simply gather the fallen banners and strengthen their position without further combat. Dokja moved efficiently, collecting the scattered flags. As he gathered them, a notification appeared. The brown flag in his possession absorbed the accumulated contributions, triggering its evolution. The brown flag transformed into a purple flag, granting access to its newly unlocked skill. Kim Yushin's voice resonated once more, cutting through the fading echoes of battle. He observed something unusual about Dokja. He had remained conscious even after hearing the voice of a constellation. Most incarnations would have collapsed, overwhelmed by the sheer force of such an existence. Yet Dokja stood unshaken, his mind steady against the weight of divinity. Kim Yushin acknowledged this resilience, but reminded Dokja of the price he had paid. To assist him, he had broken the law of plausibility, an act that carried consequences even for a constellation. Dokja, understanding the gravity of this, assured him that his kindness would not be forgotten. Despite this exchange, Kim Yushin seemed intrigued by something else. He noted that Dokja lacked an heir, someone to inherit his path. There was an impatience in him, a relentless drive, but no successor to carry forward his legacy. Dokja, however, was unconcerned. If the time came, he would make sure to pass down the events of this day to whoever would follow in his footsteps. Kim Yushin, having grown fond of Dokja, finally revealed his true intention. He wished to become Dokja's supporting constellation, to roam this world alongside him, offering his power and guidance. It was a generous offer, one that many incarnations would have accepted without hesitation, but Dokja refused. The rejection was immediate, firm, and without room for negotiation. Kim Yushin was surprised. He could not understand why Dokja would turn down such an opportunity. His power had been demonstrated in battle, his stigma, a force capable of elevating any incarnation to greatness. With his blessing, Dokja could become the most powerful in this world, yet Dokja knew better. The calling all Hwarang stigma was undeniably strong, but to call it the greatest, that was nothing more than arrogance. Kim Yushin, for all his might, was not a fabled constellation. Compared to the true legends of this world, he was still a step behind. Dokja let out a short chuckle, dismissing Kim Yushin's persistence. The era of the Three Kingdoms had long passed, and the old general needed to rest rather than meddle in the affairs of a new world. For a brief moment, there was silence. Perhaps Kim Yushin's pride had been wounded. It seemed like he would withdraw, but before Dokja could relax, a sharp pain shot through his head. Yushin's voice returned, reminding Dokja of a crucial detail. He was still under the effect of the Ganpyeonggi. Their connection had not been severed. The constellation's power still coursed through Dokja's body, twisting his muscles in unnatural spasms. Then came the real threat. Yushin had taken control. He knew about Dokja's king of no-killing status, and he was ready to put it to the test. A horrifying suggestion followed. What would happen if Kim Yushin used Dokja's own hands to kill? Worse still, what if the control was handed back at the precise moment the blade struck? The danger became real as Dokja's body moved on its own. His fingers twitched, his grip tightening as if preparing to wield a weapon. In the distance, Senga noticed something was wrong. Panic filled her eyes, but before she could approach, Dokja forced out a warning. She had to get away. Yushin pressed further, his presence overwhelming. He demanded a promise. Dokja was to choose him as his supporting constellation once the fourth scenario ended. That was his true goal. Dokja refused. The constellation did not back down. The pressure grew, suffocating and unrelenting. But Dokja had already made up his mind. If he had wanted a supporting constellation, he would have chosen the Great Sage, Heaven's equal, long ago. There was no way he would bow to this stubborn old ghost. A spark ignited in his mind. The pages of Ways of Survival flashed before him, glowing with familiar light. Words assembled, forming an impenetrable wall of text. That was his answer. Dokja activated his skill, Fourth Wall. A force erupted from within him, pushing back against Kim Yushin's control. The constellation hesitated, sensing something unnatural. His grip on Dokja's body faltered. The overwhelming presence that had seeped into Dokja's mind thinned, unraveling at its core. Yushin realized too late that he had made a mistake. At the last moment, as his presence faded, his voice echoed in astonishment. He had seen something he could not comprehend, and then he was gone. A notification flickered in Dokja's vision, signaling that the blessing of the constellation linked to him through the echo of the stars had been removed. The constellation king Hongmu the Great had taken notice of his power, now watching him with newfound curiosity. Dokja's breath came out in ragged gasps as he surveyed his surroundings. The intense battle had taken its toll, and for a brief moment he simply focused on regaining control over his own body. His limbs, however, refused to move freely. A strange sensation wrapped around them. Looking down, he realized they were bound by thin threads. Senga stood nearby, watching him cautiously. Her hesitation was evident, but she had been prepared for the worst. She had restrained him while keeping a safe distance, fearing he might lash out under the influence of Kim Yushin's control. Dokja let out a small chuckle at her resourcefulness. It was an impressive reaction, even in the chaos of the moment. Senga immediately apologized, but he reassured her that it was a compliment. Without hesitation, she moved to untie the threads. As Dokja regained his freedom, his gaze shifted to Jiwon. She had been observing everything from a distance, her expression flickering between curiosity and uncertainty. She finally spoke, explaining that she had only been passing through, that their paths had simply aligned. She had intended to offer help, but in the end, she had been the one to receive it. Dokja, however, knew better. Their next encounter would not be as allies. He stated it plainly, making it clear that the battlefield would dictate their roles. Jiwon hesitated, then smiled knowingly. In her mind, things did not always have to follow such a rigid path. Battles could forge unlikely friendships, and trust could grow even between enemies. The Hwoarang had believed in such ideals, after all. With those parting words, she turned and left. As Dokja watched her go, he wondered what kind of ruler she would become this time. Would she be a benevolent king, or would history repeat itself? There was no time to dwell on it. The battle was over, but the scenario was not. Dokja called out to Sungguk, signaling that it was time to move. Sungguk barely managed a breathless response before hurrying to follow. The group pushed forward, heading north. The aftermath of Gather the Hwoarang lay before them. Devastation stretched across the landscape, remnants of a battlefield swept clean by the ghosts of the past. Dokja called out for Minsub, and in the next instant, the figure materialized out of thin air. The recluse's cloak concealed his presence, just as planned. Earlier, Dokja had entrusted him with the task of scouting the National Palace Museum, ensuring they had precise information before making their move. Minsub reported that 9 kings had already entered the area, including the Tyrant King and the First Disciple. The flags they carried were crucial, 7 purple flags and 2 brown flags. However, among the purple ones, 2 stood out, darker than the rest. Dokja immediately recognized the significance. Those darker flags belonged to the Tyrant King and the First Disciple. Their presence confirmed that the most dangerous players had already gathered. With the situation assessed, Dokja made a swift decision. Only Senga, Gilyoung, and himself would enter. Minsub and Sungguk would remain outside, with Minsub staying hidden under the cloak. Their involvement wasn't necessary for what came next. As soon as the team moved forward, a sudden notification appeared. A hidden scenario had been triggered. Relic of Trials. The objective was to clear a relic dungeon of their choosing, but failure meant instant death. Without hesitation, Dokja selected the 3-man dungeon, choosing the Room of the Copper Acupuncture Men. His request was accepted, and immediately the environment around them shifted. The dungeon revealed itself as a vast chamber, its walls lined with copper statues. They stood like frozen warriors, their metallic bodies reflecting dim light. Their forms were human-like, but their matte surfaces and lifeless eyes held an unnatural presence. These were acupuncture copper men, classified as a 7th grade species. Then, without warning, the statues moved. A thunderous roar echoed through the chamber as they lunged toward Senga. Her instincts kicked in instantly. Her weapon fired, striking one of them directly in the torso. The impact sent the figure staggering, but instead of collapsing, it remained motionless, unaffected by the damage. Panic flickered in Senga's eyes as she called out for a solution. The statues showed no sign of injury, no visible wounds from her attack. Dokja, however, had already analyzed them. His gaze moved over their metallic forms, scanning the intricate engravings covering their bodies. He quickly pointed out the inscriptions, the subtle markings that held the key to defeating them. Each statue bore a network of acupuncture points, glowing faintly in different colors. These points determined their weaknesses. Some would paralyze, others would silence, and a select few would kill instantly if struck correctly. Senga's eyes widened as realization struck. In that moment, Dokja drove his weapon into one of the statues, striking precisely at one of the glowing acupuncture points. The effect was immediate. The copper figure disintegrated into fine powder, reduced to nothing in an instant. For a 7th grade reproduction species, its end was utterly meaningless. With the technique now understood, Dokja wasted no time. There were still 99 of these statues left. He urged his companions forward, signaling the battle's continuation. Gilyoung swiftly activated diverse communication, commanding his insects to target the acupuncture points, their tiny bodies delivering precise electrical shocks. Meanwhile, Senga reinforced their strategy using binding thread, restricting the statue's movements and creating openings for precise strikes. The team moved efficiently, executing their attacks with precision. One by one, the copper statues fell. In no time, the 3-man dungeon was cleared. As a reward, Dokja obtained a new skill, Pressure Point. This was exactly what he had come for. The ability to strike and manipulate vital points would be crucial in the battles ahead, but their mission wasn't over yet. Dokja announced the next step. They would now enter the hidden dungeon, the location of the 4-yin demon decapitator. Senga hesitated, recalling that Dokja had previously dismissed the weapon as unnecessary. If they didn't need it, then why risk entering another dungeon? Dokja's true intention, however, had nothing to do with acquiring the blade. The real reason was to hunt the kings who were also after it. Senga immediately grasped the plan. They weren't here for an item. They were after their flags. Gilyoung, already prepared for what lay ahead, spoke with chilling resolve. He understood the implication. If they were going after the kings, there was no avoiding bloodshed. Without hesitation, he assured Dokja that he would handle it. He would eliminate them. But Dokja, despite his calm exterior, was already aware. Gilyoung had noticed something. Dokja had yet to kill anyone. Senga too must have sensed this hesitation. It was why she was worried. Dokja turned to Gilyoung, cautioning him. This wasn't a game. There were real consequences, and he needed to be careful. Gilyoung, however, responded with certainty. He understood what was at stake. There was no need to worry. A new notification appeared, requiring 10 ancient coins to enter the hidden dungeon. Dokja stood before the entrance, his mind turning to what lay beyond. Once they crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back. Senga would soon realize the world they once knew was gone forever. He instructed his companions to contribute 3 coins each, while he covered the remaining 4. With 10 coins in total, they would gain entry. The 4-yin demon decapitator was buried deep within this hidden dungeon, but the true challenge wasn't retrieving the weapon. Those who had made it this far had already proven their worth. Now it was time to see who deserved to leave alive. Dokja placed the coins on the door, one by one. With a sharp click, the mechanism unlocked. As the door slowly creaked open, a strange sensation washed over them. Their vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, the scenery had changed. The waiting room was unrecognizable. At its center, a massive bonfire roared, its flames fueled by the bodies of the fallen. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh, and the sheer number of corpses made it impossible to step forward without stumbling over them. Blood pooled across the floor, creating a landscape of death. Among the carnage, a few figures remained standing. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes filled with exhaustion and wariness. Whether they were allies or had simply agreed to a temporary truce, it was unclear. They weren't fighting, but the tension in the air suggested that peace was fragile. A notification flickered that you have entered the North Star. A group of survivors slowly rose from the shadows. Greed gleamed in their eyes as they sized up the newcomers. Their leader stepped forward, voice dripping with arrogance. A question was thrown at them. Who was their king? As Dokja remained silent, the group subtly shifted. Some moved behind them, cutting off their escape, while others kept their attention locked in place. Notifications flashed, a chorus of constellations watching, some irritated by the pests, others demanding immediate action. Dokja had already made up his mind. The hesitation in the air lasted only a second before a shriek cut through it. The white glow of unbroken faith flared, its deadly arc slicing through limbs with terrifying precision. Blood sprayed, painting the air as the first body collapsed. The group reacted instantly, drawing their weapons, but it was already too late. The blade of faith moved like an unstoppable force. In one sweeping motion, 5 or 6 were cut down at once. Flesh tore, bones shattered, and the stench of iron grew stronger. The bodies stacked up, forming a gruesome monument beneath Dokja's feet. Screams echoed through the chamber. A thud followed, a sickening, heavy impact. Dokja turned to see Gilyoung standing over a fallen man, his small hands gripping a weapon, his expression void of hesitation. The man's skull had been crushed without mercy. Behind Gilyoung, Senga gripped her sword tightly. She stepped forward, stopping Gilyoung before he could strike again. Gilyoung didn't hesitate. His voice was indifferent as he dismissed the concern, but Senga's expression darkened. There was no hesitation in her eyes now, only grim determination. Without wasting another second, Senga moved swiftly. Her strikes were precise, eliminating the remaining enemies with efficiency. The blade in her hands carved through the last survivors, finishing what Gilyoung had started. Once the battlefield fell silent, Senga turned to Dokja. She made her stance clear. Gilyoung's role was now hers. She would take responsibility. Dokja studied her expression. There was no trace of hesitation, only quiet acceptance of what had to be done. He asked if she would be all right. Without flinching, she answered she would be fine. Gilyoung muttered under his breath, complaining that he could do it better. Senga placed a hand on his head, silently acknowledging his words. Dokja knew this wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. The reality of this world would keep forcing choices upon them. He questioned himself. How should he handle it? Before he could dwell on the thought, a slow clap echoed through the air. The sound cut through the heavy silence, drawing their attention. From the direction of the massive bonfire, a man emerged. He approached with an easy smile, his eyes betraying amusement rather than hostility. Dokja remained alert, watching the newcomer carefully. The man's voice was calm. There was no hostility in his tone as he spoke. He had no intention of fighting. Instead, he acknowledged their strength. He noted how they had wiped out the entire Chungjongno group without the use of passive skills. It was an impressive feat. The group had been formidable, even without a king to lead them. Dokja processed the information quickly, so that was the reason they had been so aggressive. They had already lost their leader. The man continued. His tone was casual, almost conversational. Most of the kings had already entered the dungeon. The battle inside was likely reaching its climax. However, there was no suspense about the outcome. The strongest had already made his move. Dokja listened carefully. The last king to pass through had been the one responsible for this massacre. Dokja asked for his name. The man answered without hesitation, the Tyrant King, a ruler feared across northern Seoul. The name carried weight. Whispers had already begun to circulate. Some believed he would be the one to claim the ruler's throne. Dokja remained silent, absorbing the information. The man, however, had his own thoughts. He did not believe the Tyrant King would succeed. Strength alone was not enough. A true ruler had to care for his people, to put their needs first. Without that, power meant nothing. Dokja observed him closely. The way he spoke, the conviction in his voice, it was clear. He was completely immersed in his role. The man spoke with certainty. The king he followed was different. He was someone who understood what it truly meant to lead. That was why so many incarnations stood behind him, and that was why, in the end, his king would be the one to take the throne. Dokja analyzed the situation with sharp focus. The man before him clearly had a king, one who had entered the dungeon doors like the others, yet instead of following, he remained behind, watching and waiting with intent. There was only one logical reason. He was here for recruitment. Rather than a direct demand, he framed his approach as a suggestion, offering an alliance instead of subjugation. The reason was simple, preventing a madman from obtaining the legendary sword and seizing control of Seoul. If the wrong person claimed the ruler's throne, the consequences would be catastrophic. Dokja recognized this scenario. In ways of survival, an alliance had also been formed against the Tyrant King, but the timeline had already shifted. The third regression was rewriting events in unpredictable ways. The man continued, explaining that the group was already preparing to fight against the Tyrant King. Several other kings had been approached. If there were still doubts, there was an opportunity to decide after meeting their leader. At that moment, one of the 7 doors creaked open. The atmosphere changed instantly. The man before them straightened with reverence, his tone shifting to one of absolute devotion. Those standing at the entrance fell to their knees, lowering their heads in submission as a figure emerged from the shadows. Sangha reacted first, immediately recognizing him. The resemblance to his constellation was undeniable. He had even gone as far as shaving his head, fully embracing the image of his sponsor. Dokja observed closely. The man had a clean-shaven head, a single sharp eye gleaming under the dim light. A massive club rested in his grasp, a symbol of raw power. A glance at his character profile revealed the details. His name was Sangyong, aged 26. The supporting constellation was One-Eyed Maitreya, and the attributes were Cult Leader and Maitreya King. The moment Sangyong and Dokja faced each other, their hands extended simultaneously. A firm handshake followed, each observing the other with quiet scrutiny. It was a silent yet deliberate exchange, a gesture of acknowledgement. Sangyong, known for his skills in face reading, offered to read Dokja's fortune. The offer was expected. Dokja had anticipated this moment. Without hesitation, he allowed it. Activating the skill mind reading, Sangyong's expression subtly shifted. His gaze flickered, processing the information before him. The stigma he carried, passed down from Gongye, did not grant direct access to a target's attribute window. Instead, it provided a vague interpretation, a summary of what kind of person stood before him. For a kind-hearted individual, the reading would indicate purity. For someone destined to betray, the interpretation would forewarn of future treachery. It was an incomplete but effective method of assessment. A sharp notification flickered. Sangyong's face turned pale. The interpretation had labeled Dokja as a demonic enemy, someone untouchable. His reaction was immediate. The words left his mouth in a stutter, loud enough for his people to hear. The Maitreya King's followers turned their attention to Dokja, unease spreading among them. The air grew heavy with tension, a shift in the atmosphere noticeable. But just as quickly, Sangyong corrected himself, his voice unsteady. His urgent denial dismissed the statement as a mistake. Dokja remained silent, but inwardly he understood. Gongye, Sangyong's supporting constellation, had no desire to engage in a conflict with him. It was a warning rather than an accusation, a forced restraint from the unseen entity guiding the Maitreya King. The long-haired man beside them exhaled, breaking the silence. The momentary tension dissolved, though an underlying wariness remained. Sangyong composed himself, shifting back to business. The planned operation would commence in an hour. There had been delays, but he looked forward to Dokja's contributions. Despite the return to formalities, Dokja caught something in his demeanor. demeanor. There was a subtle hint of disappointment, as if Sangyong had expected something more, perhaps a confirmation of something he had anticipated. Dokja brushed the thought aside and turned his focus to the long-haired man standing next to Sangyong. His presence had been quiet, yet his involvement seemed important. A quick scan through the character profiles yielded an unexpected result. There was nothing. The system had no record of the man named Suyong Han. Suyong Han observed Dokja's lingering gaze, curiosity flickering in his expression. There was a subtle amusement in his tone as he acknowledged the unspoken scrutiny. Dokja maintained his composure, masking his thoughts with an easy smile. It was nothing, just a fading illusion, something that, for a brief moment, had resembled a devil. A strange shift passed through Suyong Han's eyes. Something unreadable, something calculating. For a moment, it felt as though an invisible tension stretched between them. A silent understanding, a shared thought, a question neither voiced, but both considered who would make the first move. Before anything could develop, the waiting room doors creaked open. One by one, the massive doors unveiled what lay beyond. The kings had arrived. The Maitreya group grew tense, the shift in the air palpable. Around them, the waiting room erupted with voices, cheers, and murmurs as the figures emerged. Attention turned to the kings stepping forward, each carrying their own weight of authority. Soyoung provided the names, introducing the new arrivals with a confident certainty. First Gyeong Yun, the Coward King. Next Baekho Kim, the Brawl King. And finally Taisheng Gu, the Earth Dragon King. As Taisheng emerged, a voice rang out in casual familiarity. His greeting was direct, noting Sangyong's swift exit from the dungeon. His presence carried a rugged strength, a firm confidence in his own power. Sangyong, however, dismissed him with a sharp remark. His words carried the weight of an old rivalry, a lingering disdain between two powerful figures. Observing the interaction, Senga analyzed Taisheng's identity with sharp precision. Her knowledge of history provided her with immediate insight. The details matched too well. If her guess was correct, then his supporting constellation had to be Gyeonwon. She recalled the history, the later Baekje's king, the one said to have been birthed by an earth dragon. The name itself carried a sense of mockery. To many, Gyeonwon was nothing more than the son of an earth dragon, a name that had been used against him in scorn. Dokja processed the information, recognizing the significance of her deduction. She had pieced it together based purely on historical knowledge, confirming that Taisheng was indeed one of the 7 kings of Seoul. Among the gathered figures, he was one of the few who truly stood out. Senga continued, noting the abundance of incarnations tied to royalty. Kings from different eras had chosen their champions, forming a pattern that extended beyond this single gathering. Figures like Queen Jinsong were only a fraction of the rulers shaping this new reality. Dokja nodded. It was not a coincidence. The same situation would be unfolding across other regions, not just within the Seoul Dome. The game's structure had been designed this way, leading to inevitable clashes between those who had inherited the legacies of past rulers. A notification flickered to life, drawing attention to the unseen figures observing the unfolding events. One constellation, the naval warfare god, watched in anticipation, awaiting the emergence of a new fabled existence. Another, the bald army general, monitored the situation with clenched fists, his excitement barely contained. Dokja considered the scale of the conflict unfolding across the world. In Japan, figures like Nobunaga Oda and other heroes of the Sengoku period were waging war through their chosen incarnations. Meanwhile, in England, rulers such as Richard the Lionheart and Henry VIII clashed in their own struggles for dominance. The fourth scenario had been designed to bring historical constellations into direct confrontation, forcing them to fight using those who bore their legacies. Taesung addressed the gathering, his voice carrying the weight of their collective purpose. Their true target had already been determined, the Tyrant King, who had chosen the third door. 2 innocent kings had already fallen at his hands, their star jewels stolen. Many among the gathered warriors had already lost their own kings to this ruthless enemy. Dokja scanned the surrounding lobby, piecing together the implications of Taesheng's words. The scattered corpses told the full story. The Tyrant King had eliminated 2 others, stripping them of their star jewels. That meant only one thing: whoever controlled the third door would possess all 7 jewels. The key to claiming them all was the Star of Greed, the reward for the room of the North Star. Taesheng's speech grew more fervent, fueling the crowd's emotions. He framed their battle as a fight to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, promising that each warrior present would be remembered in history. His words were broad, lacking depth, but the effect was undeniable. Excitement spread through the ranks. Some responded with cheers, while others became swept up in the passion, even shedding tears at the thought of their cause. Dokja exhaled slowly, his mind contrasting their current state with their previous lives. Just months ago, these very people had lived in a democratic society. Now, they eagerly followed the commands of self-proclaimed rulers, drawn in by words of conquest and glory. Soo-young, standing nearby, observed the unfolding scene with an entirely different perspective. He found the situation exhilarating, likening it to the setting of a classic wuxia novel. The parallels were clear: a hidden treasure, a remote location, and the promise of an ancient, powerful weapon. It was the kind of story where a legendary sword remained sealed away in a forgotten chamber, waiting for the one destined to wield it. Dokja acknowledged the familiar trope, recognizing it as a staple of the genre. He had encountered it countless times before. The premise was always the same: whoever obtained the weapon would rise to unparalleled power, shaping the fate of the land. Soo-young, amused, remarked on Dokja's familiarity with such stories, sensing that he had likely read many. Dokja confirmed it, but he also understood that such predictable narratives often came with an unexpected turn. In many cases, the treasure map itself would turn out to be nothing more than a deception, a carefully constructed trap meant to lure in the ambitious, leading them to their downfall. Soo-young absorbed the idea, realizing the implication. If that were the case, then the warriors drawn here by the promise of the star jewels could very well be walking into a carefully laid snare. The one orchestrating it all would remain in the shadows, manipulating events from behind the scenes. Dokja acknowledged the possibility. The scenario unfolding before them had all the hallmarks of such a twist. However, if it turned out to be that simple, it would be a disappointment. To follow a well-worn cliche was one thing, but to execute it without originality was another. Soo-young considered the nature of storytelling, remarking that cliches existed because they had stood the test of time. They had been repeated over and over because they worked. Dokja immediately recognized the weak justification. To rely on cliches simply because they were effective was a lazy excuse. He knew that in literature, any author who leaned on such predictable tropes without innovation should feel ashamed to call themselves a writer. However, the reality before them was not a novel. This was not a story unfolding within the pages of a book. The events happening now were real. This was a world of its own, not a fiction crafted by an unseen hand. Yet Soo-young's voice carried a different weight as he posed a question. What if everything happening now had, in fact, been written by an author? What if there was a creator behind it all, shaping their fates? Dokja hesitated for a brief moment. The idea was absurd, but Soo-young's tone suggested a deeper meaning behind his words. Then came a counter question. What would Dokja do if he were the author of this world? The response came without much thought. He had never considered it before. His very name, Dokja, meant reader in Korea. He had always been the one to observe, to analyze, to immerse himself in stories written by others. The idea of being the one to write a world rather than read it was something he had never entertained. Soo-young, seemingly entertained by the thought, remarked that Dokja would likely end up using the same tropes he criticized. He too would resort to predictable patterns, shaping events in a way that thrilled readers with familiar excitement. Dokja's expression remained unchanged, but he noted the shift in Soo-young's demeanor. There was something deliberate in his words, something beyond mere curiosity. Dokja dismissed the idea that cliches were inherently bad. They had their place, but true authors knew how to use them creatively rather than simply copying what had come before. What mattered was originality. A story should never be a mere imitation. It should bring something new. The word plagiarism left an impact. Soo-young's reaction was immediate, the term catching him off guard. He attempted to brush it off, claiming that all stories were essentially the same, differing only in minor details. If everything was built upon something else, could any work truly be considered plagiarism? Dokja disagreed. He knew there were ways to do things differently, and then he demonstrated exactly what he meant. Without warning, he raised Unbroken Faith and swung it without hesitation. The blade cut through Soo-young's neck cleanly, and his head fell to the ground, yet no blood flowed from the wound. The unnatural sight sent a ripple of unease through the onlookers. A murmur spread through the crowd, voices filled with shock and confusion. Some shouted accusations of murder, others questioned if this was an act of rebellion. The chaotic whispers filled the air, but Dokja remained unmoved. Ignoring their reactions, he bent down and picked up Soo-young's severed head. The head, still conscious, responded without fear. Dokja analyzed the situation. This body was nothing more than an avatar, a projection rather than the real Soo-young. Just as he suspected, the person before him was the first disciple, a plagiarist through and through. Soo-young's voice carried amusement, but there was a sharpness beneath it. He had been right all along. Dokja was the one responsible for spreading the prophecy. Dokja scoffed at the claim. Prophecy. That was nothing more than a stolen story, a plagiarized novel disguised under a grand name. The accusation enraged Soo-young. He lashed out, denying the charge, insisting that his so-called prophecy dokkaebi was a masterpiece, not some imitation, but the reaction only confirmed what Dokja had suspected. If Soo-young was so defensive, then he had indeed read the original novel. Realizing the danger, Soo-young turned to the crowd, his voice rising in fury. He demanded immediate action. The bewildered onlookers, still struggling to comprehend the bizarre scene of a talking severed head, hesitated. Frustration flickered across Soo-young's face, but Dokja merely chuckled. The very cliche Soo-young had spoken about was about to begin. Then, before another word could be exchanged, the battlefield was drowned in a sudden explosion of light. Bright rings of energy cut through the air, carving deep lines into the bodies of those caught in their path. Blood spurted as limbs were severed. The screams of the wounded echoed, mixing with the panicked cries of those trying to flee. Dokja reacted instantly. His voice rang out as he ordered Senga and Gil-yong to fall back. In the midst of the chaos, a deep presence loomed. The air became heavy with black magic. The source of the power came from a massive palanquin at the center of the battlefield. Shadows moved within, hinting at the figure concealed inside. Then, a single command resonated from within the palanquin. The voice was deep, authoritative. The order was clear: charge. At that moment, the palanquin advanced, and the deadly rings of light moved with it. The attack was relentless, tearing through the battlefield without mercy. Dozens of people were killed in an instant, their bodies reduced to unrecognizable remains. The sight of dismembered limbs and cascading blood paralyzed the surviving warriors. Terror spread as they stepped back, their courage shattered. The battlefield, once filled with tension, fell into a suffocating silence. From within the palanquin, the tyrant king finally stepped forward. He looked upon the chaos with disdain, his voice heavy with contempt as he ridiculed those who called themselves kings. Dokja wasted no time and quickly analyzed the man's character profile. His real name was Yonghu Jong, a man of 33 years, backed by the powerful constellation Great King Heoncheon. It all made sense now. His strength was overwhelming because he was using multiple system packages, enhancing his abilities beyond what was originally intended. But what stood out the most was the hidden item, the three-wheeled ring, an artifact that did not exist in the original novel. The presence of this item confirmed Dokja's suspicions. The Tyrant King must have prophets working under him, feeding him information about future scenarios. His synchronization with his constellation was near perfection, but that also meant he was walking a fine line. If he deviated too far from his established narrative, the dokkaebi overseeing the scenario would undoubtedly question his plausibility. The Tyrant King spoke again, acknowledging his past self, but dismissing it as something long dead. A wide, frenzied grin spread across his face as he declared his intent. From this moment forward, he would carve a new chapter into the history of this land. He had no fear of the past, because he was no longer the man he used to be. At that moment, an overwhelming surge of magic erupted from him. The sheer force of his synchronization reaching its peak sent out a destructive shockwave. The unfortunate warriors standing too close to him were obliterated in an instant, their bodies bursting apart from the raw energy. Panic threatened to spread, but the voices of Sengyong and Tai Song rang out in defiance. They commanded their forces not to retreat, urging them to stand their ground and fight. The anti-Tyrant King alliance, despite the terror before them, refused to break. This battle was not a one-sided slaughter. Among their ranks stood formidable kings, including the Maitreya King and the Earth Dragon King. As their forces united, the initial disadvantage began to fade. Dokja, still holding the severed head of Soo-young, turned his attention back to him. Soo-young was smiling. There was no fear in his expression, no trace of concern. If anything, amusement flickered in his eyes. Dokja knew that look. Something was still in play. Soo-young's grin widened as if he had been waiting for this moment. He was well aware of Dokja's plans. He knew that the ongoing battle was the perfect opportunity for Dokja to seize the Four-Yin Demon Decapitator while the kings were distracted, but things would not go as Dokja had hoped. Soo-young had been preparing for this day far longer than Dokja. The prophecy was just one part of the game, but in the end, it would be his narrative, the cliche he had crafted, that would dictate the outcome. Sparks erupted in the air as the mid-level dokkaebi reappeared. The battlefield momentarily froze, all eyes turning toward the floating figure. The dokkaebi spoke, its voice filled with amusement. It acknowledged the ongoing battle, noting how even the historical constellations were giving their all. It understood their desperation. After all, the goal was clear, to rise in status, to become a fabled constellation. Then, with a snap of its fingers, a new system window materialized before everyone's eyes. The message was direct that only 5 kings would be allowed to participate in the next challenge. The realization sent murmurs through the crowd. 14 kings were present. That meant some of them would be eliminated before they even reached the next stage. Confusion spread. People questioned whether there were more kings hidden among them. The dokkaebi confirmed that 12 kings kings were inside the hidden dungeon at that moment. Panic followed. Accusations flew as the crowd turned on one another, desperately trying to uncover any hidden kings. Amidst the growing chaos, the tyrant king's laughter rang out. He mocked their foolishness, delighted that they had turned against each other instead of focusing on him. But Taishong, refusing to let the distraction take over, called out to the warriors, urging them to keep their focus on the tyrant king. Then a loud voice cut through the noise. The severed head of Suyong bellowed from the ground. He had seen it with his own eyes. A hidden king stood among them. He pointed out towards Dokja as the target. All attention shifted toward him. Expressions darkened. The weight of suspicion crashed down on him. Without hesitation, Dokja let Suyong's head drop from his grip. The severed head hit the ground with a dull thud. Then, without a moment's hesitation, Dokja lifted his foot and crushed it beneath his heel. The crowd erupted in fury. The bloodlust surged toward Dokja, Senga, and Gilyong. They braced themselves, preparing for the inevitable attack. But before they could make a move, a thin blade cut through the air and stabbed one of the nearby warriors. The battlefield descended into chaos once more. The prudent king and fighting king, already exhausted, reeled from the sudden assault. The Maitreya king and Earth Dragon king, taken off guard, suffered devastating blows. Even the tyrant king, the strongest among them, staggered as multiple blades pierced his body from behind. Rage filled his voice as he cursed the ambush. But something was wrong. Dokja's eyes sharpened. He understood immediately. The attackers were not ordinary humans. The ones who had turned on their kings did not bow when their heads were severed. And then it became clear. The star jewels, the prize symbols of the fallen kings, vanished one by one. They were swiftly gathered, stolen by unseen hands moving through the battlefield. A triumphant voice rang out. The cliché had won in the end. A figure moved through the air with effortless grace. A beautiful girl landed on a high ledge, her laughter echoing across the battlefield. She was the fake king, Han Suyong. Dokja observed the figure standing atop, realization settling in. The fake king was real, and contrary to expectations, she was a woman. Suyong, the one who had infiltrated their ranks using her avatars, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In her hands, 7-star jewels glowed with immense power. They pulsed, their energy converging as they were sacrificed for a greater purpose. The legendary 4-yin demonic beheading sword was being summoned. The stolen jewels vanished, their essence feeding into the formation. The plagiarist had now become the master of the sword. Suyong grasped the hilt. A manic laughter erupted from her lips as she lifted the weapon high. Power crackled along the blade, surging outward in violent waves. She had claimed it. The sword was hers, and she intended to slaughter everyone in sight. Nearby, Senga's voice carried a trace of worry as she turned toward Dokja. She needed guidance. Gilyong also hesitated, concern flashing across his face. They had all seen what the sword was capable of. It was a weapon of destruction, one that held the potential to turn the entire battlefield into a massacre. Dokja remained composed. There was no panic in his gaze. He assured them that they would be fine. His certainty confused them, but there was no time for hesitation. Suyong swung the sword with full force, her laughter echoing through the chaos. A brilliant surge of magic power erupted from the blade, sweeping across the battlefield in a blinding arc. The raw force alone should have been enough to wipe out everything in its path, yet the expected devastation never came. People braced for their bodies to be torn apart, expecting to explode from the sheer energy, but they remained standing. The wave of destruction barely scraped the surface of what was anticipated. Confusion flickered across Suyong's face. Her magic power was supposed to be overwhelming, yet the battlefield still stood. She had burned too much of her strength using avatars, and more importantly, the 3 main kings were still alive, their presence resisting the effect of the sword. Shock spread through her expression as she tried to understand. The weapon in her hands wasn't behaving as it should. It was too weak. She had expected total dominance, yet the results were disappointing. Dokja understood the truth she had overlooked. The 4-yin demonic beheading sword wasn't famous because it was a great weapon. Its legend existed because its wielder had been a great warrior. The sword itself was nothing without a master who could truly wield it. A smirk tugged at Dokja's lips as he turned toward Han Suyong. Her grand spectacle had collapsed into a pathetic display. He couldn't help but find humor in the irony. She had spent so much time writing stories filled with cliches, yet here she was, caught in one herself. Soo-young, unwilling to accept the humiliation, raised the sword and swung it at Dokja. Her frustration boiled over as she lashed out, refusing to acknowledge the flaw in her plan. Dokja laughed, his amusement echoing through the chaos. The Tyrant King, regaining his composure, roared with fury. His pride would not allow him to be humiliated any further. He charged forward, his overwhelming power shaking the ground beneath him. Around him, the other kings also reignited their battles, alliances shattering as the fight devolved into a full-scale meet. Dokja remained still, calculating. He knew that someone should have arrived by now. The north was not too far. There was no reason for this delay. The thought nagged at him, but before he could ponder further, a system notification flashed before his eyes. The current number of kings had dropped to 11, then almost immediately it was 10. The number continued to fall at an alarming rate. A grin spread across Dokja's face. He was finally here. Panic spread through the battlefield. The remaining kings stiffened as they noticed the sudden drop. The realization sent a wave of fear through them. Someone was eliminating the kings, quickly and efficiently. The atmosphere grew tense. Whispers and frantic murmurs filled the air as the numbers continued to dwindle. The uncertainty in their expressions turned to pure terror, but there was one among them who did not fear. The Tyrant King. Amidst the panic, he erupted into laughter. He didn't care. To him, the chaos only meant more bodies to crush beneath his strength. He slashed through another opponent, his blade cutting deep as his victim howled in agony. He prepared to unleash another devastating strike with the three-wheeled ring, its power surging in his grasp, and then the ceiling caved in. A deafening explosion rocked the battlefield as a massive storm of magic power crashed down. The overwhelming force tore through the air, swallowing everything in its path. The Tyrant King was caught in the destruction, his body convulsing violently as he screamed in agony. The devastating energy disassembled everything it touched, reducing living beings to mere particles. His roars of pain were drowned by the sheer force of the magic storm. His body, once a symbol of dominance, was mercilessly erased. When the storm finally settled, the battlefield was left in stunned silence. The number of remaining kings had dropped to 7. At the center of the devastation, one figure stood, unmoving, unshaken. The presence of this lone figure sent chills through those nearby. Han Soo-young staggered backward, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She refused to believe what she was witnessing. Her voice trembled as she muttered in disbelief. This wasn't possible. This was complete madness. Dokja recalled the words of Han Soo-young's avatar. Among the 7 kings of Seoul, the Tyrant King was known as the strongest, but that was not entirely true. He was powerful, but he was not the strongest. Dokja had encountered the true ruler before anyone else, the one who stood above all others, the most powerful of the 7 kings of Seoul. Just then, a furious voice erupted through the space, shaking the very ground. Dokja turned with a smile. A large black flag waved behind the approaching figure. The Supreme King, Yu Jung-hyuk, had arrived. Jung-hyuk's rage was palpable as he marched forward, his presence suffocating. His fury was directed entirely at Dokja. He was out for blood. Dokja remained calm, silently noting Jung-hyuk's arrival. He had sent him all the way to the north, yet somehow Jung-hyuk had already acquired a black flag. His anger only confirmed that Hee-won and the others had done their jobs well. Jung-hyuk was furious. Dokja turned towards Soo-young. Without hesitation, he demanded the sword. Soo-young hesitated, her grip tightening. She refused. Dokja's tone darkened. If she wanted to survive, she had no other choice. Dokja acted. He called out to Gil-yong. Gil-yong had been waiting. His eyes turned white, his power activating instantly. A tearing sound echoed through the dungeon as something massive pounded against the walls. A moment later, the sickle of a monstrous creature slashed through the stone. The 6th grade insect king, Titanoptera, had arrived. The entire cave trembled under the weight of the colossal insect. Its power alone threatened to bring the battlefield to ruin. Jung-hyuk turned, momentarily distracted. That was all the time Dokja needed. He struck. Soo-young gasped in pain, her grip loosening. The 4-yin demonic beheading sword slipped from her grasp. Dokja seized the weapon, but he didn't stop there. His hand reached for the flag hanging from Soo-young's neck, snatching it away as well. A perfect opportunity, a perfect execution. A notification appeared, signaling a significant change. Dokja's purple flag had absorbed the accumulated achievements of the black flag. With that, the purple flag evolved into a black flag, granting him access to its full set of perks. He had successfully completed the first qualification for becoming a king. The number of kings remaining dropped to 6. From behind, Han Soo-young's furious scream echoed through the battlefield. She was enraged, calling him a thief, but Dokja paid no attention. His focus remained on the Tyrant King. The fallen king lay amidst a pile of shattered stone, his body crushed and broken beyond recognition. Dokja wasted no time, swiftly gathering the items that had belonged to him. A message confirmed his acquisitions. The 3-ring loop was now in his possession, along with the dragon jar. But there was no time to linger. Jung-hyuk was already closing in, his speed terrifying. He covered the distance between them in an instant. With no other option, Dokja reacted quickly. His eyes darted across the battlefield before he abruptly ducked behind the nearest king. A horrified cry followed. Taesung, the king of later Baekje, barely had time to react before Jung-hyuk's relentless strike crushed his skull. His body collapsed as his flag was claimed. Jung-hyuk did not stop. His attention remained locked on Dokja. There was no escaping this time. Jung-hyuk demanded an answer, his fury rising. Dokja barely had a moment to comprehend his words before realizing the reason for his rage. Jung-hyuk's mind was fixed on a single thing, his sister. His question was direct, filled with lethal intent. Where was she? Dokja hesitated, but the moment he tried to deny it, Jung-hyuk's skill activated. His lie was instantly detected. In that fraction of a second, Dokja cursed under his breath. The murderous glare in Jung-hyuk's eyes darkened. His patience had run out. If Dokja did not answer immediately, there would be no second chances. With no other choice, Dokja attempted to negotiate, raising his voice to reason with him, but his words were met with cold suspicion. Jung-hyuk's grip on his sword tightened, his body seething with restrained fury. The moment Jung-hyuk raised his sword, ready to strike, a sudden voice echoed from above. It carried an air of amusement, laced with mockery, halting the battle before it could reach its conclusion. The dokkaebi's voice resounded through the battlefield, reminding them that the fight could not yet begin. With an eerie sense of finality, the dokkaebi announced that all qualifications had been met. The number of kings had dwindled to 5. The remaining kings had now fulfilled the requirements to proceed, and their bodies were forcibly pulled from the battlefield. Space twisted around them, an invisible force dragging them toward the final stage. Jung-hyuk lunged forward, arm outstretched, but it was already too late. The force of the transfer seized him mid-motion, warping his surroundings beyond recognition. His voice barely reached the fading figure of Dokja before everything shifted. The transition was disorienting. Dokja's body felt weightless, as if being sucked through a void. The sensation of being forcibly transported numbed his senses until, suddenly, impact. A sharp, jarring force sent him crashing against an unseen surface. The shock rattled his mind, dragging him back to awareness. Then, a notification appeared before his eyes. A rejection. He wasn't qualified to participate in the last king's qualification. The words sat heavy in his mind. Something was wrong. Before he could process it, laughter erupted from the air. The dokkaebi's voice returned, filled with ridicule, delighting in his mistake. In his rush to eliminate the kings, Dokja had overlooked a crucial detail. His own group's target station had yet to be occupied. Changsan Station. A new message confirmed his failure. Without securing the designated station, he had no right to proceed to the final stage. The dokkaebi mocked him further, relishing his frustration. There were no shortcuts in this scenario. No matter how far he had come, the rules had not changed. He had assumed victory, only to realize that he had played himself into a corner. Panic crept into his thoughts. The battle had already begun. By the time he returned to Changsan Station, it would all be over. There was no time left. Then, a voice broke through his turmoil. Sengo was running toward him, her arms wrapped around the unconscious body of Gilyong. But she was not alone. More figures followed behind her. Among them, one stood out. Hee-won. She was moving quickly, gripping the small hand of a young girl. The young girl broke the tense atmosphere, her tone filled with uncertainty as she questioned whether her brother was truly here. Hee-won reassured her once again, frustration evident in her voice. It wasn't the first time the girl had asked, but despite the confirmation, she hesitated before speaking again. This time her complaint was different. She was hungry. Dokja's gaze shifted sharply toward Hee-won. His tone carried a mix of disbelief and irritation as he questioned why she was even here. He had specifically instructed her to stay at Changsan Station. Hee-won, unfazed by his reaction, shot back her own frustration. She had no intention of standing around endlessly at the station while the scenario unfolded. More importantly, the girl had not eaten since morning. Her words carried an edge of accusation as she questioned whether Dokja even cared. Wasn't this girl his sister? Before Dokja could respond, the girl's voice cut through the conversation with blunt finality. She denied any relation to him. Hee-won faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the unexpected response. Then, with a scowl, the girl added that her actual brother was far more handsome. Compared to him, Dokja was just ugly. Very ugly. Dokja blinked. The sheer absurdity of the comment left him momentarily speechless. Hee-won, still processing the situation, turned toward him again, demanding an explanation. If this wasn't his sister, then who was she? And more importantly, why was she here? A storm of thoughts raced through Dokja's mind. The revelation was absurd. To think that Jung-hyuk had a sister, one like this, was something he had never considered. The plan had seemed perfect. Jung-hyuk was supposed to go north after reading the note he had sent with Jae. That had been the foundation of everything. The entire setup hinged on Hee-won rescuing Jung-hyuk's sister, giving Dokja the leverage he needed to manipulate him. It was a ruthless strategy, but necessary. Without this level of interference, Jung-hyuk would have won the scenario outright. Yet now it was all unraveling. Before he could dwell on it further, Hee-won's voice snapped him back to reality. She was watching him carefully, noting his sudden change in expression. She asked where he was going. Dokja gave the only answer that mattered. He was heading to Changsan Station. Hee-won's reaction was instant, confusion mixed with disbelief as she questioned his decision. There was no reason for him to go back there now. Without responding, Hee-won turned to the girl, instructing her to bring out the item she had been given earlier. The girl nodded and without hesitation placed a hand inside her mouth. What followed was unnatural. Her mouth stretched beyond normal limits, expanding as something large began to emerge. A moment later, an object far too big for a child to carry was pulled from the depths of her throat. It was an ability unlike anything ordinary, a skill unique to her. Yumiya's exclusive skill inventory. Dokja's focus sharpened as he stepped forward. His eyes locked onto the object she had retrieved, a lump of stone. There was something familiar about it. Hee-won's gaze remained steady as she watched Dokja process the situation. The realization dawned upon him in an instant, eyes widening as the pieces finally connected. This wasn't just any stone, it was the flagpole, the very item required to claim a station. For the first time in the entire history of Ways of Survival, someone had done something completely unprecedented. Instead of occupying the station, Hee-won had brought the flagpole to him. Hee-won watched him expectantly, noticing the hesitation. There was no reason to delay. The moment had arrived. Without wasting another second, Dokja planted the flag into the ground. A series of notifications flooded his vision. Changsan Station was now under his group's control. The system acknowledged the action. His strategy had worked. For a brief moment, he couldn't believe it. This loophole had never been used before. Yet, against all odds, it had succeeded. He had done it. Excitement rippled through the group. Hee-won and Yumiya clapped, their enthusiasm breaking the tension of the moment. But before there was time to revel in the victory, another message appeared. The battlefield was calling him back. His body was forcibly pulled through space, the surroundings shifting in an instant. The battlefield of the last king's qualification materialized around him. New conditions were laid out. The throne was meant for only the bravest. The one who sought it had to desire it above all else. A king had to stand alone. More notifications followed, altering the very foundation of the battle. From this moment forward, all kings would lose the support of their sponsors. The power of items would be suppressed. Skills, stigmas, and unique abilities. Everything was sealed. Every king's stats were forcibly balanced, reduced to an even playing field. Only one would be left standing. As Dokja's vision adjusted, the battlefield of Gwanghwamun unfolded before him. It was utter chaos. The absolute throne loomed at the center, surrounded by clashing figures. Familiar names stood among them. Jiwon, the king of beauty. Sangyeong, the Maitreya king. Jung-hyuk, the supreme king. And finally, in the corner, a middle-aged man, the neutral king. The neutral king's eyes met Dokja's, his hands raised slightly in silent acknowledgement. This battle should have been over in less than a minute. If the original story had followed its course, Jung-hyuk alone would have ended it in a flash. But now everything had changed. A sudden attack cut through the air. Sangyeong lunged forward, his legs swinging in a vicious arc. At the same time, Jung-hyuk countered. His kick slammed into Sangyeong's abdomen. A normal battle would have ended right then. A direct hit from Jung-hyuk should have crushed any opponent. Yet Sangyeong barely flinched. His body absorbed the impact, his stance hardly faltering. With all stats equalized, brute force alone was no longer enough. Jiwon turned her head, her gaze settling on Dokja. Their eyes met and she gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Dokja observed her carefully. It was surprising that Jiwon had lasted this long. Given the circumstances, her endurance wasn't bad at all. She stood her ground, showing no intention of backing down. If she didn't withdraw now, she would have to be eliminated. Before the confrontation could escalate, a sharp cry tore through the battlefield. Sangyeong collapsed, rolling on the ground in agony after taking a direct hit from Jung-hyuk's fist. Until now, the fight had remained balanced. With skills and stigmas sealed, no one should have had an advantage. But little by little, something had begun to shift. Jung-hyuk's attacks were getting stronger, faster, more relentless. Dokja quickly pieced it together. There was only one way this could be happening. Jung-hyuk had found a loophole. The scenario had restricted everything. Skills, stigmas, even item effects. Every king had been reduced to the same stats, set at an even 10 across the board. On the surface, it was a fair fight, but there was one thing the scenario had never restricted: coins. Jung Hyuk was burning through his reserves, pouring his wealth into increasing his physique, agility, and strength. With each exchange, his power grew beyond what should have been possible in this battle. A voice echoed across the battlefield, the dokkaebi overseeing the scenario addressing the kings. The system had no issue with this method. It was completely within the rules. The coins they had earned were theirs to spend. However, there was a warning. Any stats gained through this method would be reset once the scenario ended. Those who used their coins now were essentially throwing them away, but Jung Hyuk didn't hesitate. The moment the dokkaebi finished speaking, he launched forward. His foot cut through the air, landing a brutal flying kick against Sang-gyung's chest. The force sent the man flying like a missile. The battlefield fell silent as a notification confirmed it. The Maitreya king, Sang-gyung, can no longer fight. Ji-won's expression darkened at the sight. She had no way of knowing how many coins Jung Hyuk had left, but the reality was clear. Most of the kings who had made it this far had already exhausted their resources in previous battles. They had fought relentlessly, using every last coin to survive up to this point. Jung Hyuk, however, was different. Dokja quickly estimated. Jung Hyuk had always been careful with his spending, accumulating wealth throughout his regressions. At this stage, he should have at least 30,000 coins saved. No, given how quickly he had progressed this round, it was possible he had closer to 40,000. Ji-won made her decision. She slowly raised her hands, signaling her surrender. A message appeared, confirming what everyone already knew. The King of Beauty, Ji-won, has forfeited. Jung Hyuk finally turned to face Dokja. The fury in his eyes faded, replaced with a calculating gaze. It was understandable. Dokja analyzed the situation. Jung Hyuk wasn't rushing in immediately. Instead, he was observing, gauging the extent of Dokja's stats. He wanted to use the minimum amount of coins necessary to win. There was no doubt. His goal was clear. If he claimed the ruler's throne, he could secure his sister's safety. But he was about to realize how wrong he had been. At this moment, there wasn't a single king in Seoul with more coins than Dokja. Without hesitation, Dokja spent an enormous amount of coins, his vision filling with a storm of notifications. He poured everything into his strength, watching as the number soared. By the time he stopped, 72,000 coins had been spent, and his strength had reached a level that shattered human limitations. His fists clenched tightly, power surging through his body. A message confirmed it. Your strength has broken through the limits of a human. Dokja couldn't help but laugh. The sheer absurdity of it was overwhelming. Jung Hyuk had no idea what he was about to face. It was almost unfair. Dokja adjusted the power in his fist. A strike at this level could be devastating. If he wasn't careful, he could accidentally kill Jung Hyuk. The space around his clenched hand bent slightly, distorting under the sheer force. Dokja understood this phenomenon. According to Ways of Survival, once a stat exceeded 3 digits, it no longer functioned within human limits. The sensation was overwhelming. A single punch now carried the weight of 1,000,000,000. Jung Hyuk's eyes widened in alarm. He had realized the difference between them. In a desperate attempt, he hurriedly spent coins on agility, trying to close the gap, but it was too late. Dokja's fist connected directly beneath Jung Hyuk's chin. The impact was deafening, like a sonic boom ripping through the battlefield. Jung Hyuk's body shot through the air, blasted away like a meteor. His flight was anything but smooth. He slammed into a barrier, the force rebounding him in the opposite direction. Then another, and another. The impact repeated 5 or 6 times, his body ricocheting through the battlefield like a broken projectile before finally crashing onto the ground. The battlefield fell into silence as the final announcement rang out. The Supreme King, Jung Hyuk, can no longer fight, and the final proclamation echoed across the space. Kim Dokja had passed all the qualifications for the ruler's throne. It was over. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.